And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this first public event of Racial Diversity UK. It's a Nuffield Foundation research programme. I'm Anne Phoenix, and I'm Professor of Psychosocial Studies at UCL, and I will be chairing the first half of this afternoon's proceedings. The second half will be chaired by Amin here, and we are both on the Nuffield Foundation Trust Board, and we co-chair the RDUK steering group. Ash is Emeritus Professor at Cambridge University and was a 1931 chair in the Department of Geography. Before I tell you about the format for the afternoon, I'm going to do the very usual routine things that are done at the subject of afternoons. First of all, there is not going to be any planned fire alarm. So if you hear one, please leave rather than wait for it to end. And the staircase is on the other side of the lifts. And if anybody needs help going down the stairs, please let us know. The toilets are on this floor on either side of the lift, facing the reception desk. That's it for the announcements. Well, this is a hybrid event, and there are many people who are joining us online. So I'd like to welcome them and to tell them that if you think of a question or comment, please immediately put it in the chat, and it will be picked up later on. So do that whenever you want to. But it means that for those in the room, if you're asking a question, regardless of how loud your voice is, you do have to use the microphone so that people online can hear us. And Liz Gilfillan over here will be facilitating the online comments and questions. She's the programme head of RDUK, and I'm sure that many of you have been in touch with her already, and if not, over the next few years that we will have calls to talk to her for one reason or another. I'd like to start by thanking the other members of the RDUK steering group. Brian Bell, perhaps you could just do a little talk. And he's also on the Nuffield Foundation Trust Board, so he'll get a little bit more of an introduction when he speaks. Raj Patel, here. He is the Associate Director of Policy for the Understanding Society Survey at University of Essex, and he's a founding member and trustee of Action for Race Equality. John Solomons, anyway, is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick, and many of you have been in touch with John because for the last 30 years he's been the editor of the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies. Deborah Cadman is also on the steering group, and she was the Chief Executive of Birmingham City Council until last year, but she's unable to be here today. We're very grateful to Ralph Bogan, who's at the back somewhere, who has done so much to help us organise this afternoon. And if the afternoon runs smoothly, Ralph must get enormous amounts of credit. If it doesn't, dealing with us is like herding cats, and we haven't done what he said. Okay, and also thanks to Bianca Kruner from IT, who's managing the audio visuals for us today. Okay. You have to know that the event is being filmed, and that means that the audience will be filmed at certain points. If you don't want to be seen on screen, would you please let the person holding the camera know what you want to do. So getting on to the programme, there are three things that we wanted this afternoon to achieve. First of all, the Chief Executive of Nuffield, Gavin Kelly, will tell us why it's an important programme for Nuffield. Then Amin, who I introduced earlier, will give a short overview of the RDUK programme. And those two presentations are designed to signal the commitment of Nuffield, both from the executive and from the trustees, for a racial diversity UK programme. Then the second thing that I want to do today is to introduce the first set of RDUK funded research projects. Each project has either just started or is about to start. And so it's the first time that we have the opportunity publicly to hear the researchers' visions for their research and to think about how the projects can be brought together to contribute to the start of the programme. Then you'll have a 15-minute comfort break, and we will police it because we have so much to get through, so sorry about that. But after that, the third part, Ash and Amin will chair a panel discussion. And we have some exciting speakers here who are not funded in RDUK, but who will raise issues that we think are crucial for the development of the RDUK programme. We aim to end by 5 o'clock, and for those of you who are here in person, we would very much like you to stay if you can, and to network, to talk to us, to talk to other people in the room. And for that reason, we've provided some drinks and nibbles that will be outside later, not too soon, but just when we're ready. And you know, those of you who are online, I'm really sorry that you won't be able to join us, but perhaps on another occasion. And following on from that, we're very aware that in the room, you as the audience bring a wealth of expertise that's really relevant to RDUK, and also to lived experience of racial diversity and racial justice that are crucial at the moment. So we've got in the audience colleagues from academia, civil society, government and public sector agencies, think tanks, and research centres. This event and future RDUK events are partly designed to draw on your collective expertise and to help shape the future of the RDUK programme through that expertise. So we hope to strengthen the impact and value that we get from the programme by also making sure that you contribute, that you're engaged with it. So to make sure that you have a chance to express your views, not only will we invite questions and comments at the end of the presentation of the projects and at the end of the presentations that come in the third panel, but we'll also be inviting your feedback in writing, with space for you to share any additional thoughts or questions that you feel we didn't cover during the afternoon. And we'll share a QR code for this at the end of the event. We've got post-its and pens for those of you who prefer to write rather than to do this online. And there's a box out in the reception area where you can post your notes. But you're also very welcome to raise any issues that you wish to with RDUK staff and with steering group members during the networking session. So we encourage you to talk about the event on social media, and please to tag Nuffield Foundation. Our social media handles are on slides that, not here now, but will be. So to get on with the first part of the afternoon, I'm really, really pleased to welcome our Chief Executive, Gavin Kelly, to speak. Gavin is an economist who's got an outstanding track record of leadership in public policy. He's been a senior civil servant, both in the Treasury and in education departments, and he led the Resolution Foundation before taking up the reins at Nuffield in January. So, Gavin, thank you very much. Can I invite you to speak to us?
Thank you so much. And in my experience being introduced as an economist, is you have to do a lot of work to win back the room after that. So bear with me. I was just looking at the audience for this event, who's actually in the room today. It really is just work around. It's a fantastic collection of different people from different organisations across civil society and academia who have braved the cold, bitter weather to make it here this afternoon for this conversation. It's a really important conversation for us, so thank you all for sparing us your time. For those who don't know Nuffield so well, just briefly, we're an independent charity. We were founded in the turmoil of World War II with the purpose of trying to bring reason and rigour to the thinking about the issue of post-war Britain. We advanced that mission today by tackling a range of key social and economic challenges, both by funding work, research, and by undertaking our own cutting-edge research, and also by supporting innovation. So everyone in this room knows that we meet in turbulent times, often troubling times, economically, politically, socially. The challenges facing the country are profound, and it's not just here, it's elsewhere too. I think everyone in this room also knows that in periods of turbulence, often immigration and racial difference become flashpoints. And we're certainly seeing that in the US, we're seeing it in France, we're seeing it in Germany, we're seeing it across a large number of European nations. And as we know, we are also seeing it here in the UK too, with the far right, for instance, visibly mobilising as we speak. We can also detect it, I think, in a very clear shift, discernible shift in the tenor of public and political discourse that we have been witnessing, whether it is racist online discourse spilling into our streets, or whether it's divisive voices from other countries appearing in our country and amplifying other divisive forces here. It's certainly the case that those who were always uncomfortable with the UK's racial diversity now feel much more emboldened to say so out loud. And at the same time, I think we are witnessing something of a crisis of confidence across mainstream politics when it comes to asserting the benefits of Britain's multiracialism. For some communities, of course, we know that this hostility never had really gone away. I'm thinking particularly of those who lost their jobs, their homes, and were indeed deported through the so-called Windrush scandal, or the many thousands of people every year who are subject to Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, and other racially motivated hate crime. So our theme today is obviously important, it's timely, and it is urgent. So when it comes to Nuffield, when we approach issues, we are always mindful of the past, and as Ashwell, I think, set out in his remarks, history very obviously weighs heavier on this topic than on almost any other topic that we might be working on. But our approach is also to be future-facing, and unashamedly so. We look to understand context, underlying causes and trends, and we do so in order to shape potential solutions in the years and indeed the decades ahead. And in doing this, in all areas, but I think most acutely this area, we need to be really conscious of the body of evidence that already exists. We are not starting from nowhere, we are starting from having deep wells of insight and evidence out there. And this really was brought home to me as I was reading yesterday, ahead of this event. I reread a study on race and ethnic inequalities by Heidi Mercer and Ross Warwick. Heidi, I think, there she is. A fantastic piece of work, I need to say, supported by nothing that's part of the wider detailed inquiry. It sets out so much, and there's so many other pieces of work I could reference. It's almost wrong to do so, but I just read it, so I wanted to give it a shout. We build on that, and we also want to situate the work that we'll be talking about today and the work that we fund in the years ahead within a wider Nuffield context. It is part of a broader body of work. It very much is central to our recent strategy, which maybe not all of you have read, but is available online. And at the heart of that strategy is a question about how we build an inclusive society in the context of fast-changing demography and different ways of life. And you can't think about that at all if you're not thinking about racial diversity and racial injustice. It runs through a number of our key themes that we're working on and we'll be doing more work on. The changing nature of inequality in the United Kingdom, where we have a variety of projects exploring different aspects of disadvantage and the intersections between them and how they compound. It runs through the work we want to do on Britain's shifting demography, where we are committed to examining the nature of population change in the decades ahead in this country and the implications that has for society, for economy, and for different communities. the questions of race also run right through the work that we're very committed to on place and community, where we foreground the importance of local identity and connections and trying to find ways of helping support communities to function better. So let me just say by finishing, I really do want Nuffield to be a place, to be a home that really grapples with the pressing social questions of our time. That means working on this topic, obviously. It also means, tackling issues like rising poverty, the societal implications of climate change, reimagining a broken family justice system, the ethical challenges of AI. I could go on. There are a number of topics we're working on. What runs through them is that when we address them, we do so in our own way by bringing sound evidence, different types of evidence, but sound evidence to bear on them, and always using that evidence to try, wherever we can, to think about how we chart a course towards change. And that is very much the case in relation to Racial Diversity UK. We want to support rigorous, impactful research. You'll be hearing about the first cohort of those projects shortly. But we also want to put that work, that evidence, in front of groups of practitioners, thinkers, civic leaders who are in a position to help us work out where we take it and how we use it so it actually does change lives, which is part of our motto. So we really are delighted. It is essential, and we are delighted that we have the sorts of people in the room that we have today. So I want to leave it there to let the real work of the session begin. I'm going to hand you over to another trustee, Amin, and I should say, we don't just have one, nor two, we have three trustees here today. I'm blessed to have three trustees. There haven't been three trustees speaking at any event I've been taking part in since I've joined Nuffield, and they are deeply committed as trustees, but also specifically to this programme of work, and I'm deeply grateful to all three of them for doing so. Anyway, with that, Ash, please come and say a few more words about the programme.
Hello, everyone. Can I add my own welcome to all of you? It's fantastic to be in this position of launching RDUK with all of you here and so many people online. And Gavin, thank you very much for your remarks on what matters in the foundation. And already you have seen that the questions of race lie very much at the heart of what the foundation wants to do. And you also, Gavin, for highlighting that the hostilities that we're seeing now are not new, but just a very loud resurgence of tensions that have never been resolved. These are the tensions of Britain's colonial and post-colonial history, played out in the arrival and treatment of subjects from across what we've now euphemistically called the Commonwealth since at least the war, and of course long before then. And the arrivals carried the hopes, ambitions, energies of many, including the parents and forebears of many of us in the room, including me. But often enough, they confronted the colonial hierarchies of racialized difference, of deep inequalities in wealth, resource, and power, and the very raw history of dehumanizing violence and exploitation, which of course today continues. So colonial migrations have profoundly shaped contemporary Britain. We see this in the facts of our diverse population, our cultural moorings, and indeed also all of our diaspora connections. We see this in the variegations of national identity and belonging. What is British other than the product of all the people who live here? We see this in the troubling legacies of racial discrimination and institutional racism. In the very rough deal for racially minoritized populations in health, employment, housing, criminal justice, and labour market. And also we see this in increasingly racially motivated hate crimes. So the situation isn't that great. We see this in the continuity of a narrative of white Britain losing out from migration. And this is a narrative that's lasted for a long, long time. It has its intensive periods, like today. So my point is that today's debates on immigration, diversity, belonging, make no sense without acknowledging this history. There are continuities and indeed lessons of the post-colonial that academic and policy interest in the future of a diverse Britain simply cannot ignore. This, at least, is the premise of our new Racial Diversity UK program, RDUK. And of course, it is a forward-looking program, as Gavin has already alluded. It's intended to generate evidence of where we are in composition, in experience, and in aspiration, and how we can become a racially just and inclusive society. Policy practice side of the program is very important for us. But this forward look is mindful of how we got here, recognizing the need to confront and unpick the colonial legacies that have too often been marginalized or ignored. This historicity is contemporary and it is urgent. The RDUK program opened for applications last year. We're delighted to be introducing at this event the first set of projects, as Anne said, funded through the program. Our second application round is just closed, and we look forward to sharing more information with you next summer about our growing research portfolio. The program will continue with annual application rounds in autumn each year for at least another 4 or 5 years, and also with many more events like today's to share evidence and also policy and practical insights. Okay, enough of all the introductory remarks for today. I think we're already running 2 minutes late. Let's crack on with the program and hear from our 4 RDUK PIs, and Nasar, Sunder, and Sarah, and Keon, of course. Would you like to please come up to the
Yeah, right.
You can see how the afternoon is going to go. Well, thanks very much to Gavin and to Ash. And I think from hearing them, you can see why it makes sense for RDUK to be part of the Nuffield Foundation, and indeed why that is the programme that Nuffield is part of. So I'd like to move on now to introducing our 4 speakers, who we are delighted are the first 4 to be funded on the programme, as Ash said. And I'm going to introduce them very briefly to give them time to talk rather than their backgrounds. You can look them up online if you want to know more about them. So we're going to start with Professor Nasar Meer, who's Professor of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow and an honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh. Published lots of very interesting things that I'm not going to tell you about. Sunder Katwala is director of British Future, which is an independent think tank that he founded and that aims to stimulate constructive conversations on integration, identity, race, migration, and social cohesion. Dr. Sarah Kyambi is founder and director of Migration Policy Scotland, which is an independent think tank that produces research and policy insights on migration, integration, and demographic change in Scotland. Professor Keon West is head of research at the Runnymede Trust and a visiting professor in the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics. And I'd like now to invite them to follow each other, so starting with Nasar, and to give us no more than 10 minutes about their vision for their projects. Yes, please. Thank you.
Hey, great, you can hear me. Well, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you everybody for being here, despite my coerced applause. And thanks to Ash and to Gavin, RDUK colleagues and the Foundation more broadly for the generous help and support. If I just click here by magic, my PowerPoint will come up on top. Hey, look at that. So our 24-month project. So I'm going to use some notes. I don't normally use notes, but Anne told me if I don't speak to 10 minutes, I'll take my funding away. So I've scripted a few notes. A 24-month project, racial equality since devolution, divergences, outcomes, and frontiers. Will begin with a seemingly simple question. That seemingly simple question is saying, well, what's devolution meant for racial equality across the UK? Now, it's not far off, 3 decades now, that since some very key powers were devolved from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament, to the Senate in Wales, and to the Northern Ireland Assembly in Stormont. And in that time, through these legislatures, 19 governments have pursued policy programmes on areas including health, on education, on criminal justice system, on the environment, on culture, media, sport, amongst others. Yet there's been no systematic UK-wide study of how this has either been shaped by or in turn helped shape racial equality approaches, or indeed necessarily a systematic study of social outcomes. Now, in its place, what has tended to prevail, I suppose, is kind of a default UK story of race equality, which has been anchored in England's broader post-colonial history and anti-racist struggle, which then later featured in public policy discourse and practice. Something which then lacks a kind of robust comparative evidence base from which to understand what's been going on since devolution. And we might say, adapting Kipling's terms, what do they know of the UK who only England know? Right? And our project addresses this through a comparative study of how race equality has been governed and with what consequences, as much as we can discern since devolution. We'll look at where jurisdictions have diverged in approach, in outcome, and whether there's accumulated learning on racial disparities that's being reflected in newer risks, newer challenges in terms of the governance and regulation of AI and climate adaptation. And we'll assemble a picture of some of the outcomes within what is quite a fragmented data landscape, where devolved statistical producers often collect and publish their own figures, and often in different cycles, and sometimes using distinctive classifications of race and ethnicity. And not always aligned with the methodology either. The aim is really to kind of bring something of a clear-eyed, evidence-based approach to these concerns, which is produced through insights that are usable, yes, to other academics, but also to civil society stakeholders and to policymakers more broadly. Of course, what the relationship is between evidence and policy and what that relationship should be is, of course, highly contested. And the strand of social science, I think, that is most persuasive here is to accept that governments don't merely use evidence to solve what they deem a policy problem, but rather often have to frame something as a policy problem warranting that effort. And here, this slide setting out the kind of legislative backbone suggests two stories at once. Kind of a shared legislative spine across the UK, with then diverging secondary architectures and narratives, including in how substantively devolved governments have made efforts to tackle the harder challenges of racial equality in terms of institutional and structural racism. It's notable, for example, that the Welsh Government explicitly commits itself to an anti-racist approach and has a stated policy ambition, I quote, to make Wales an anti-racist nation. In Scotland, there's now an independent anti-racism observatory to monitor the implementation of the race equality framework up there. It's not quite the OBR, but it's suggestive of a different key, I suppose, than the UK government's inclusive strategy approach, in which the term institutional racism is notable by its absence. And here it's often, I think, missed that devolved governments connect these policy moves, yes, to wider national narratives, but they do so in a way in which they appeal to minority nationalisms that aren't exclusive of ethnic and racial minorities by definition. They haven't evaded their post-colonial inheritance. And that's something which we've picked up for a long time in the qualitative work we've done with Black and minorities in Scotland, also colleagues in Wales, where they will self-define more as Scottish in those contexts than Black and minorities in England will self-define as English. They make an appeal and a claim of a nation. There are suggestions of this as a secondary race equality architecture where devolved powers are allowed specific duties and action plans that go further than basic UK-wide requirements. It's important in this context is to bear in mind that while all legislation is by definition public policy, a lot of public policy isn't legislation. It comes in the form of norms, of conventions, of practices, of phraseology. For example, in the Fair Work programme in the US, in Scotland, it talks openly about adversely affected racial communities and about systems and structure that do not work for those who are adversely affected by racialisation. And the Welsh school curriculum now, as I said, as a mandatory module on post-colonial migration. So that all sounds good and well. And an intriguing sets up nicely for a whole set of intriguing questions in terms of, okay, what's involved? So, because devolution isn't just an administrative rearrangement, as I suggested, this project isn't just an audit of what has. It's a study of governance itself, of how different constitutional settlements are shaping what governments in these contexts are thinking race equality is and should be, and what they've actually done about it. And that's reflected in how we've tried to organise the work. It's in 3 connected work streams, which you can see here plus questions. The first focuses on divergences. It tracks policy and legislation over time and asks where those changes or differences in approaches actually become apparent, and in what ways is that kind of discursive feature of public policy being folded into what is otherwise often quite limited instruments. The frameworks and the narratives that policy sit in. The second cluster is concerned with outcomes. It's one thing to map the legislative and policy divergence, but the key question should be whether that translates to different lived outcomes for racial-led minorities. And here we're bringing together existing quantitative indicators on employment, income, housing, health, education, and concept of the criminal justice system. And we kind of want to read these outcomes as best we can garner them alongside qualitative material from civil society and community. We're interested in these patterns over time and space. Do jurisdictions that have gone further rhetorically or in the policy statements and commitments necessarily see narrower gaps or different trajectories in these outcomes? And where are the inequalities still kind of stubbornly persistent despite apparently ambitious frameworks? Now, this isn't about causality per se. It's very hard in public policy work to demonstrate simple causality, especially when there are so many compounding factors. But we're trying to build this comparative evidence base that lets us better ask questions about what kinds of interventions are associated with more or less progress. And then the third cluster looks at frontiers. And here you ask about whether race equality is being effectively integrated into things like climate adaptation strategies and what that looks like in different strategies, and how emerging governance of artificial intelligence deal with and draw on the decades now of accumulated learning about racial bias, about structural discrimination, about how disparities are cumulative. And we're trying to make sure that kind of race equality is present in places where future risks and opportunities are being created. And the last point here, and the last point of my presentation, before all my money goes, is that these work streams, sit in an impact infrastructure. We're establishing a community of practice and the people who are involved in this, bringing together policymakers, public bodies, regulators, society actors from across jurisdictions. And the idea is it's just a project where we disappear for 2 years and then come up with a report. The community practice is that standing forum for us to kind of test how emerging findings resonate or don't resonate, and how that's consistent in all jurisdictions. We have an external advisory group chaired by Sunder Katwala. Again, a couple of people from here are on that advisory group, and they'll help us in terms of convening at key points within the research and findings policy summits. Finally, all this feeds into comprehensive output, which we will share and disseminate widely. And that's the ambition. By the end of the project, we'll have a much clearer picture of how devolution has shaped race equality, where the most promising practices are, and where the gaps are still that need urgent attention. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to be here, and it's exciting. I think it's a great moment for the Nuffield Foundation to be embarking on this project. It's great to be in the sort of pioneering group, have that sort of collegiate spirit of what we can do together at a time like this. So the British Future contribution to this, it's called Voices for Equity, moving from evidence to action. So I'll tell you something about the evidence we're gathering, but we're going to need your help in the room as well as to how we're going to move that to action over the 3 year period. Just before I get to the what, just a couple of sort of thoughts about the why now, what now, in a way. I mean, clearly we're becoming a more diverse society over time. One of the things that I think will affect the success of this country is how much confidence do we have, our institutions, do we have as people, as citizens, that we're handling well being an increasingly diverse society, because nobody is going to get to put it all back, even if that thought has re-emerged for some people. I think actually we did settle that question half a century ago. Most of us know that, some people don't. So, but we obviously have quite factious, quite anxious, quite divided society about that experience of change. Over 10 million experiences of being Black, Asian, of mixed ethnicity in this society differ quite a lot by the geography, social class, being born here, coming here, and so on. The 50 million experiences of experiencing a changing society, welcoming the diversity it's brought, but fearing it, trying to stay clear of it, being somewhere in between. It changes. The climate of how that's going changes from time to time. So what do we need to do? In some ways, I think the story of race and diversity in Britain has never been more complex in terms of the opportunity, outcomes, the advantages, the limits, the discrimination, the disadvantage, what's actually happening, how it feels. The actual social story has never been more complex, and yet the conversations we're having seem to become more simplistic, more polarised at the same time. And what do we do about that? So there's a challenge, I think, for evidence. We've got a lot of evidence in this country. It's important many of you in this room have provided a lot of the evidence, but having the evidence and it being clear what the gaps are doesn't automatically mean the action to close those gaps or to do what we thought ends up in different kinds of content. So that's something we have to think about. I mean, it matters, when we have made progress in this country, we didn't make it by chance. We did have good legislative frameworks. They were all white parliaments, but they passed anti-discrimination laws. They gave a framework. We did collect, and they didn't do this in other West European countries, and that mattered. We did collect evidence about race as well as evidence about immigration. We realised some points of immigration and race and diversity were different, adjacent questions, not identical questions. And we acted sometimes, and we didn't act enough. I think as well. So we've got the progress and the limits were made. But I think we know a lot of social facts. So we have censuses, we can count heads about who lives where, what is their ethnicity, and what is their faith, what is their nationality. So we've got lots of facts about who gets GCSEs, who earns well, who doesn't earn well, who gets a degree, and so on. And I think we have less evidence about sentiment and attitudes towards the changing society. To some extent, we have better evidence across the whole society, the majority group, about the way this is a society somewhat polarised by your educational status and your social class, and where you live. And I think the changes, the experience of change within minority groups in our country is somewhat more profound in many ways than the experiences within the majority group, because of the story of migration and integration and opportunity and disadvantage. And yet we don't, I think, have that granularity. We can say, different minority groups are doing different things, but how that is different by gender, by generation, by geography, by class. I think it's an important thing to get. So we will be collecting evidence about that. The first year we will be getting a bit of a state of the nation picture. We will, we're looking at the minority experience of Britain, but not in isolation of the majority experience of race in Britain. So deliberative and evidence work. I mean, and, we do this at different times. I was talking to people about, the anti-racism protests 5 years ago. You could feel that things were changing. They were changing a lot for the younger group and so on. Things have changed a lot since then. So I have a State of the Nation idea for you at the end of the first year of our work. In the second year, I have a deep dive into younger people. We're thinking sort of 14 to 24, but I've got a 13-year-old in my house, and she's got the vote, and there's a year younger than her who've got the vote. So should I be thinking about 12 to 24, the 16-year-olds? And if we could just shift the balance of voice a bit in our society and amplify a bit more. We know there are closer relationships across groups within that age group, but also it's different by gender and by geography and so on. So we've got to work out how to do that. And by the third year, and 27, 28, we're heading towards the end of a political cycle, and don't know if Prime Ministers will have had by then or anything like that, but we'll be having, I think, quite a high stakes general election in this country, in which different claims will be made from the populist right, the mainstream right, and the centre left, and the populist left, and so on. So there's a chance to inform and influence that conversation. So the evidence to action bit, we can collect the evidence again on what do people feel about policy change and things they'd like to be changed. We can debate the language of race, and we will. But what do we want to see? Is that a shared perspective across groups and generations? Where is there a big clash in what people prioritise? Where is there perhaps some latent consensus that we overlook and ignore? We'll know more about that, and we'll be able to advocate things about what we'd like to think about that. So the evidence of how our society understands the way it's changing, what people's priorities are, we'll have the evidence, we'll be able to share it with different institutions, different actors that have things. And then I think we'll need to talk across projects, across many people outside those projects. What are our opportunities to build constructive coalitions for change? We can, I think, have a more constructive debate about race equality in this society than the ones we're offered from different flanks of our debate, but how we can take evidence and turn it into actionable stories about social change, I think will be the way to make progress in the future, as we sometimes made in the past. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be here and to get a chance to tell you a bit about our better mixing project. Diversity is changing rapidly, and Scotland is the UK nation that has seen the fastest pace of change since the turn of the century, going from being a nation of net emigration to immigration, replacing Pakistani-born people with Polish-born people as the largest foreign-born group. More recently, new patterns of arrivals under the post-Brexit immigration system have seen again significant change, with many new patterns of arrival and settlement under that new system coming from former British colonies. Migration Policy Scotland is Scotland's migration think tank. We exist to promote insight and dialogue that build a positive migration future for everyone. The Better Mixing project looks to support Scotland's diverse future with a more nuanced and more up-to-date understanding of how changing diversity is experienced by different groups and what can be done to foster positive interactions and equitable access to shared space and services. Our focus is particularly on how new migrant groups, established migrant groups, and diverse Scottish-born people interact in Scotland, how they encounter each other, looking also at how that is different or the same across affluent and less affluent areas. The importance of this mission is shared with the motivation that we see in Nuffield Foundation's strategy. How do we move towards a UK comfortable with and benefiting from its growing racial diversity? Change is challenging. The growing polarisation and fragmentation that characterises our current debates and characterises our current politics makes this task only more urgent and more daunting. I find myself often overwhelmed and sometimes afraid, concerned about where we're heading, worried about what the future holds, and how we keep ourselves, how do we build a positive future out of the challenges and the ugliness that is emerging in the debates and conversations that we're seeing around us. The more advanced demographic challenge in Scotland adds even more to that urgency. Scotland needs migration and we need to do it well. But Scotland also offers scope and maybe even greater hope. Positive political consensus that has existed for a long time on migration, that it's beneficial to Scotland and that it has enriched Scotland. It provides scope to try and innovate and to find new ways forward. And the Scottish Government offers an additional scope for impact and uptake alongside local government and the prospect of influencing thinking and practice UK-wide and contributing to learning that we can all use in different ways. Our project involves mixed methods. There is a quantitative analysis that's going to mine Migration Policy Scotland's quantitative immigration survey data and extend that data set, making more analysis possible. We're also doing large-scale qualitative research, which draws on our expertise in using peer researchers to deliver large-scale research at pace. The research locations have been deliberately chosen to include less studied areas with research sites in Aberdeen City, Fife and Edinburgh. The highlight is probably our policy laboratory. This is a year-long policy laboratory process planned in each of the research sites. Migration Policy Scotland is a think and do tank. We work on implementation as well as new ideas and new research. Our policy laboratories are grounded in the conviction that collectively we believe that we hold more solutions to the problems and challenges that we face than we realise. In carefully designed ways, we will bring together diverse stakeholders, policymakers, practitioners, employers, local authorities, third sector and civil society organisations and local residents to find new ways forward to make practical solutions to the difficulties we face that are suited to the dynamic diversity that is emerging in those areas. What are we hoping to achieve? Looking ahead at the change that we want to create, I can't read my slides from here. We want to generate a robust evidence for practitioners and policymakers to understand how to support better outcomes for an increasingly diverse society. We really believe that interventions should be evidence-based and evidence-led as well as effective. Our policy laboratory process fosters real-world initiatives that put research findings into practice as pathfinder initiatives. So working together with policymakers and practitioners to trial new ways of working, new ways of trying to navigate challenges. And in trying those pathfinders, we will be influencing wider policy and practice audiences with the data that generates and the learning that we make together. We've already started this work in September. Our first research on the main research findings will be due in May 2027. A showcase on the pathfinders and the learning that we've made through that will be in March 2028, with a final report in August 2028. We're very pleased and proud to be funded by Nuffield Foundation, and it makes me feel hopeful about the change that we're going to contribute to within this programme. I'm also feeling really excited about the other projects that have been funded and that will be funded under this programme. New thinking, new approaches, and new initiatives are currently so very, very much needed.
Yes, except I was watching you and you had trouble reading your slides, and I intend to move so I can. Just setting my stopwatch as well. So does this work? Okay, great. Thank you. Is this also working? Can you still hear me? Great, fantastic. So thank you again very much for having me. Thank you so much for funding us. I want to highlight a couple of organizations. First of all, thank you very much for Nuffield. I am Keon West, the head of research of the Runnymede Trust, which often okay, good. I'm Keon West, head of research of the Runnymede Trust, which describes itself as the UK's foremost race equality charity think tank. Not a think and do tank, just a think tank, but we can work on it. But also our collaborators at the Work Foundation, which is attached to Lancaster University, without whom this work would not have been done. So no work like this happens because of one person. And I do want to take into account all the wonderful people who've contributed to it. So first things first, could I ask, raise your hands if you know what deindustrialization is? Hands up. Oh, that's everybody. Oh, that's really good. So I don't have to tell you what it is. Deindustrialization, when you look up the definition, is something really quite bland. So it's a shift away from manufacturing and heavy industries towards a service-based economy, which when you say it like that sounds quite neutral or in fact positive. It sounds like a really fun thing. But when you know what deindustrialization is, it's not that. It's a stripping away of middle-income jobs. It's community disintegration, it's job strain, it's poor health, it's a proliferation of low-skilled, in quotation, because what does that mean? Except an excuse to pay people badly, poorly paid work. It's stuff like that. It is crumbling churches, it's empty houses, it's neighbors that you don't see anymore, it is children who you've lost touch with because they had to move to the big city, because whatever was going on in your town wasn't going on anymore. That is deindustrialization. And it is a terrible thing. And we know that it is a terrible thing. If we'd done it differently, perhaps it wouldn't be, but it certainly has been. And so we need to talk about things like renewal and reinvestment and regeneration. This is incredibly important, especially outside of London. And we are talking about those things, and it's incredibly important that we do. But there is a problem. When we tell ourselves the story of deindustrialization, there is a hyper focus on white deindustrialization, on white people and white communities. Generally, the experiences of people of color who've also experienced deindustrialization are not accounted for. They're marginalized. And this is unfortunate because it brings certain things to the surface. It supports the right-wing agenda. So I think other people have spoken about this, the right-wing agenda splitting the working class into the white working class and a bunch of other people who are not working class somehow, even though they clearly are, or are not white enough to be counted amongst the people who whatever political party is really striving for. And that split is deeply worrying, it's deeply offensive, it's politically problematic, and perhaps what is most offensive to an academic, it's not true. It is fundamentally an inaccurate view of our history. If we want to talk about our history more accurately, we have to do better than that. So how will we do better than that? Well, we start by recognizing that ethnic minorities have always been part of the story. Not only that, ethnic minorities have always been and still are, however you define the working class, ethnic minorities remain disproportionately part of it. And they are disproportionately part of the people who are affected by deindustrialization. So not only is it a crime that their stories are left out, because you shouldn't leave out anyone's stories, you are leaving out the stories of the people who are most affected by the thing that is happening. So that's step one. We recognize that. And step two, we ask certain very specific questions in the work that we're going to do. I did write them down because they are quite specific, so I will read them. So one, what is the social cost of deindustrialization, particularly for communities of color? So when we talk about the crumbling places of worship, the empty neighborhoods, how is this affecting the communities of color? And two, how are ethnic minorities affected by insecure work in the economy today? So when we're overrepresented in certain jobs that are particularly difficult, particularly challenging, particularly poorly paid, how does that affect us today, particularly in post-industrial regions with higher levels of insecurity, unemployment, and inactivity? And then 3, how should local actors and policymakers regenerate labour markets to ensure good jobs, particularly for young people? So apologies if you don't count yourself among that group of young people, but we're looking particularly at young people. How can we ensure that they can get good jobs in these deindustrialized regions? The way we're going to do that is a little bit complex, but I think that's fair enough because they did offer us an awful lot of money, so we should do quite a lot of work. Like many of the other projects, it's a multi-method project, so you probably understand and assume the combination of quantitative and qualitative research, a lot of numbers and a lot of words, but also it's a combination of research and policy, which I think everyone else has as well, but also engagement, which is something that people are less familiar with. So research, we collect the data; policy, we tell the people in power what to do with it. And engagement is working with the communities themselves to figure out what they want us to do with it and how we can help empower them to get it done. So the quantitative work is the kind of things that many of you are probably familiar with and that I'm familiar with from my academic work, the ruthlessly quantitative, lots of numbers, large-scale surveys, annual population survey, ONS data, to see where is the money gone, who's poorer now, what neighborhood has crumbled, who can't get what kind of job. That's the kind of thing we're looking at. The qualitative work, we interview people in 3 specific sites, so Leicester, Preston, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Manchester, and the arithmetically astute amongst you will probably realize that's not 3 specific sites. That's because we are starting with 5 and then narrowing down to 3 depending on what we find. And in there, we walk around, we talk to people, we interact with them, and we collaborate with them to figure out what kind of solutions they'd like to build. And then, of course, we do policy analyses as well, where we look at particular strategies that have been proposed and how these things gel with the research that we've done and with what the community would like to see. In terms of outputs, and actually I have extra time, so I'm probably going to end early, but I don't think Anne will mind if I do. No, Anne's very happy if I end. In terms of outputs, there's a mixture of outputs. So they're the kinds of things that Runnymede is really quite good at. So if you know anything about Runnymede, you know that we love to do the reports launched with Parliament. We're always talking with the APPGs. There's always some parliamentary party, or whatever, the APPGs that we do all the time. We're always doing that. We're good at it. We go to Parliament, we talk in the House of Lords, we talk in the House of Commons, and they listen to us, and that's good. And you also know that we love to do policy briefings, which should be released around 2027, which we're good at and we do a lot of. So that's not stretching ourselves. That's the stuff we know how to do. That's the bread and butter of Runnymede. We're very solid at that. There are other things, however, that will push us and that we're quite excited about and that we will be working with our collaborators to do. So we're going to do things like interactive maps, which involves tech that we don't know how to do. We will figure that out. We've hired a new person who's specifically our comms tech person who will do that. So you can poke a little thing at Sheffield and you can see what's changed over time. You can touch a little thing in Preston and you can see where the money's gone, and that will be really fun. We're going to do video and other visual outputs. We say that officially to discuss things in an appealing, accessible storytelling way. But the truth of the matter is that the Runnymede Trust does a lot of things like 30, 40, 50-page reports, which, in case this isn't apparently obvious to everyone, young people do not necessarily like to read. They're not queuing up to read 50-page reports. And a lot of the communities with which we work have also, and we have asked them, this is not a stereotype, they have made it abundantly clear they are not interested in our 50-page reports. Can we make this more approachable? Can we make it more accessible? Can we make it more interesting? They have asked for that, and we're going to deliver that. And then we're going to do things like public community storytelling sessions in research areas based on the findings, which is not so much us telling people what happened and what should happen, but it's letting them tell us, letting them tell each other, letting them communicate things in their own words. And I think that's fundamentally important. Again, it returns to the engagement, to the giving back to the community, to the working with the community, as opposed to simply coming in as experts and telling them what to do. If we do this well, then yes, we will support that reinvigoration, that regeneration, that reinvestment that is so important. And quite literally, every political party, everyone is saying should happen. But if we do it properly, we can do it for everybody instead of just a narrow slice of the UK that seems to be capturing everyone's attention. And with that, I'm done. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks to the 4 speakers for taking the their presentation so interesting, but sticking to time. That means that you have time to make comments, to ask questions, and so on. So if you could please indicate if you want to speak in the room. I will take a couple of people in the room and one person online for a first round. And if when I call on you, you could just say your name, that would be really helpful. So who would like to go first? Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, I forgot to say that, what I did say before, that you have to use the microphone for us and those online.
You did, my fault for forgetting. Thank you to the speakers for your very, very interesting introductions to your research. My name is Amy. I'm here representing Friends, Families and Travellers. I think your focus on sort of post-war, and I don't mean to speak for anyone, there is kind of a general focus on sort of the post-war migration from the Commonwealth and also kind of contemporary shifts to migration patterns. And this is really, really important. And I'm coming from a position of solidarity among racialized peoples without wanting to reify the very, very destructive construct that is race. I suppose my question is, what about communities such as Romani Gypsies, Roma people, Irish travellers who have hundreds and hundreds of years of history in this country but are often missing from these debates? I'm just wondering, is there any way that those communities can be included in discussions of racial justice in this country? Thank you.
Anything else in the room? Oh, is there somebody there? Somebody was pointing.
Don't be shy.
Okay. No, I thought somebody was pointing at someone.
Thank you to all speakers, my name is Jonathan Liu, and I'm the chair for Mingai in London, which is a Chinese charity for the British Chinese diaspora. My question is really very much about how do you mitigate against some of the personal views that may be biased when you're doing, for example, I think, Keon West, you talked about oral history, because we also do oral history. How would one mitigate against having a more general view rather than one that perhaps people who are disadvantaged will have a very strong and maybe negative view? And it's a question to the whole panel.
Something online?
Yes, we've got one comment online from Kindy Sandhu, who I think is addressing this particularly to Runnymede, saying with devolution, it would be helpful if Runnymede talked to mayors and council leaders. That's a comment, but I think there could be a question in there about how you're going to engage regional leaders in the work that you're doing.
Yes, I think technically Nasar's doing devolution.
Could you please use?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I think it was just a minor correction on the question, because we're doing deindustrialization. Nasar's doing devolution, which I just wasn't sure which one they meant. So if they did mean,
I think she means deindustrialization.
okay.
I mean, just in terms of the experience of Gypsy Roma traveller communities, they'll feature in my project, because one of the things that I'm interested in is how the devolved governments have understood race and how they approach race equality. And, intellectually, racial categories aren't silo distinct. They're different racial formations, projects, you might call them, but they often have common racial logics. And I'm interested in our case, for example, not least in data analysis. Scotland had different questions on the Scottish census in terms of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities, but also different statutory duties within the Scotland specific duties from 2012, where you have to have a proactive approach to not only the non-discrimination but the inclusion of Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities within, especially education, but not only. So they'll definitely be caught in my project, and so they are part of the story.
I think it's very striking. I think all Western democracies have some similar social economic challenges going on. The discourses are very different. I think one of the striking things about the British discourse of race is how much it is shaped by the Empire and Commonwealth experience. When you think about Windrush, you think about Enoch Powell, you think about more modern cases. My parents happened to be India and Ireland. That makes a lot of sense for me. But it then does mean, I think, that, you know, when we say Asian, we mean South Asian rather than East Asian, and actually white minority groups of all kinds kind of don't fit very well into this. And I think it makes less sense the way we talk about this for other minorities. I mean, there's the comment about too many black and Asian faces on television the other day by a Reform MP. Actually, black people are, if you want to count heads, etc., somewhat, you know, more, Asian people somewhat less, white minorities invisible entirely, but nobody even notices or counts that. So I think travellers are very specifically disadvantaged, discriminated against groups. But I think the story race hasn't really taken that on board in the way it needs to. So how we capture that, I think, is a really good challenge.
Just on Amy's question first, I mean, there's been some very interesting debates and changes in terminology, specifically to include other white groups in ways that I think you're suggesting and advocating for. In terms of our project, we are looking at newer migrant groups, more established migrant groups, as well as, you know, social populations, and where people from those communities, Roma, Gypsy, travel communities, feature in our research sites, we would very much expect to include them.
Just to understand, are we answering all the questions or just one question?
So far, we've only gone on to the first one. So
Okay.
let's start with that, and then you can move on.
Okay, so starting with your question, I want to hear you, by the way. The problem that you have cited is a very real problem. Runnymede recently released a very good report on school exclusion, on suspensions and exclusions. And it was fantastic. You can go look it up on the website. It's amazing. It captures all this data about all the things that parents go through, all the ways in which the schools really do this combination of weaponized incompetence and strategic removal of certain particular safe guardrails. And it's awful. And even knowing some of it, you read it, it'll break your heart and change your mind. What I thought was interesting was when I looked at the graph, and the graph shows the rates of suspensions and exclusions. And you start, of course, with, you know, the white British people right at the bottom, and they're essentially just never suspended or excluded, and kind of follows a curve up through the Asian people and then up to the black people that's quite high. And then you get to the top of the graph, and there's this huge bar that's bigger than all the other bars put together. And that's Gypsy Roma Traveller bar. That's the bar on the graph. And it's something that we don't talk about enough. And I would say even at Runnymede, sometimes something that we don't talk about enough. But it is something that we've definitely learned to talk about more and more explicitly. And we did a whole extra thing. We looked at that bar and we said, we're going to do a whole thing just on this particular group to understand what's going on. So I do hear that it's a real problem. And as you said, it's a problem people have ignored in other places. But I think it's also a problem that people are growing more aware of all the time. I'll come down and so even more strongly, race is made up, it's not real. There's no such thing as black people, no such thing as white people. We made it up to treat people badly, and we're still doing it now. In that sense, there's no such thing as Gypsy, Roma, and Traveller people, but in a very real sense, there's no such thing as money, but we still treat people badly because of it, and we can't ignore it because we made it up. And even though they're technically white on many of the census papers, that doesn't mean they're not mistreated in a racialized way. So,
What about moving on now to think about the other two questions, which is about personal views, what one would do in thinking about personal narratives and so on, and also about mayors and regional leaders. So,
Okay, I'm happy to start with that. So the Runnymede Trust, again, we're really good at that, the mayors and the regional leaders part. Perhaps, again, we could be accused of a greater focus on the London area. We do operate out of London, so I can see that. But we do regularly connect with local leaders. That's one of our strong points. So if there are specific recommendations around that, again, love to hear it. If you have specific people that you'd like us to contact, do literally send me their email addresses. We will do it. We are not afraid to do it. We really want to do that. So I hope that answers the question. I hope it's an encouragement, but we really want to do that. On the question of balancing the issue of believing what people say, which I think is me paraphrasing, but you take what the community say, how do you know it's true? And I want to first of all say that I'm not one of, and maybe this isn't really the position I should have as the head of research at Runnymede, but I don't by default think that what people say about the situation is true. I think it's possible to be very ill and to misunderstand the thing that is hurting you. It is possible not to know that the reason you're suffering is tetanus versus cancer. And that's why we have doctors. That's why we have experts who tell us this is the thing that's going on, this is what's going wrong. But I think the question is one of balance, because as in the case with illness, you can see people who misunderstand what's going on and misunderstand the treatment, but you can also have doctors who have an over-reliance on big data, an over-reliance on depersonalized information, and who miss the obvious problem of the patient sitting in front of them. And we know that this big depersonalized data prioritizes certain perspectives, certain races, certain histories, certain classes, and ignores others and leaves people suffering horribly. And so I don't think we would ever advocate for a kind of blanket. And I don't think you were saying that we would, but we wouldn't advocate for a blanket. The communities have said so, therefore it's true approach. But we would say the communities have said so, and therefore it's important. And we merge it with the bigger, less personal data we have to produce something that we hope is in fact the truth.
There we go. I think on that question, understanding how you treat the research data that you gather, how you evaluate that, and how the role that it plays in when you analyze and interpret it is something that we will consider carefully in our research design. We are bringing together representative quantitative data with research in different research sites, and part of the analysis is about comparing how do those stories look different across those groups and across those locations and across different levels of affluence, and that brings us insights. I think again where you run up against people's beliefs getting in the way of effective solutions and evidence-based solutions is almost also in the policy labs, where using our experience in policy labs is that bringing that carefully structured, carefully designed research data to bear on policy and practitioner conversations in an iterative process like that, where you build pathfinders, where you find ways to challenge beliefs that get in the way or don't seem to have any substance, or asking people to think again about, you think this is the way to get to this result, but actually people are telling us something different. Can we have another look at that? What do you think that means? That is, I believe, a way, we've talked a lot about how much evidence we have, I think, and we do. I think evidence still needs to be brought up to date. The picture is changing very rapidly. There's absolutely a case for new research and new evidence. I think one of the key challenges that we are really wanting to face head on is implementation. Is how do you turn that evidence base into new policies, into new practices that actually have the outcomes that you intend? And I think that's a really big challenge across all kinds of policy areas, but it's certainly one in terms of the policies and the practices that we're wanting to look at.
I think there are a number of different things that we said about biases and subjectivity and, being aware of them, but also, you've got hypotheses, what you're expecting to hear, what you'd like to amplify, what you're uncomfortable about when you hear and what you do about that. So that's an important thing. When you're having deliberative conversations about a topic like race, there are some really interesting challenges. I think, for example, white British people are quite deferential in mixed groups about race towards minority participants, and really quite like it if a minority participant introduces a tougher issue so that they can acknowledge that and so on. And so actually how you give people permission to have a voice and to speak and to raise the things that are there rather than to go home without having said it. We particularly looked at sort of boundary audiences, the people who say we're not allowed to have a voice these days. And there's a really cathartic effect in having conversations where people talk about things they think they're not allowed to talk about. But it makes a big difference if you bring people back a second or third time, because then they tell you they trust you in the second conversation when they didn't in the first conversation because they weren't sure if it was a trap or not. So there's a lot going on, but there's another point that I think is underneath that. So there are some rational things we could do to have fairness. But let's say you have a society, and we might still be in society, whatever you might want to do with the internet, and to put us smash things up and break up the BBC. But we might have a society where there's a latent pro-fairness idea that if we could have fair chances for everybody and no unfair barriers to everybody, and mutual respect and a fair share of voice, that if I could have that, I'd give that to everyone else. And, you know, at the school gate on a good day in the sixth forms, that's where we are. Except everybody feels that they particularly are unheard at the same time, subjectively. And in a way, they're all right at the same time about that. That's what makes leadership very hard, actually. So in a way, how you in a way lean into the subjectivity, but the change that's felt very fast and too slow has been too fast and too slow. So what do we do about it now? So in some ways, I think we have to embrace the bias, subjectivity, emotion, and see what we can do with it. You know, if we put the pedal on for long enough to get somewhere with it.
I'm not sure I have a great deal to add to that, but I suppose I would just say, so in terms of, you know, technical parts of research, there are all manner of checks and balances we can use in terms of triangulating data quality and all that stuff. So we do that as a matter of course, but I mean, what you call bias, I would call data. So when I'm interviewing, I mean, so Wales introduced the socioeconomic duty. So, you know, identity grounds, background for potential discrimination, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, and so on. In the original Equality Act of 2010, socioeconomic status was one equivalent ground. The Westminster government didn't proceed with it. Later, Wales and Scotland did. When I interviewed a policymaker in Wales about their motivation, they were narrating that decision through an idea of nationhood. They said it was good for the nation. It was appealing to an idea of nationhood, a rationale. And I thought that's very important because here's a senior policymaker who is driving, you know, an approach to the large distribution of funds, and he's doing it through a narrative account of maybe non-rational justification, which I wouldn't otherwise get from looking at policy documents. So that's really important data. That's not bias. That's what it is. Yeah.
Thank you. One question over there, please, and then one online, and they'll have to be brief.
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Monica Moreno from the University of Cambridge. I would like to ask how much you are integrating, or if you can speak to, how can your projects and overall the proposal here is about actionable research, and what are the challenges to do actionable research, in the sense that I feel like there's a reliance on policy, and that policy work is what's going to change racism or inequality. And of course, there is a big part of that, but I'm just trying to imagine what else we need to be doing, because we've been doing that work for a very long time, and we still have very many challenges. So if you include, and if you are thinking or encountering, how can we expand that or bring that an angle where our research can be taken out in ways that more people than just the participants or the policymakers can take it on as a social chat. Maybe it's a huge question, but I just wanted to say that that's what I'm thinking about. And yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've got lots of questions online. I'm going to take one from Angela Dye from Loughborough University, who asks whether the research teams are encountering, whether from policymakers or communities, resistance to race equity and EDI work more broadly, and if so, how are they coping with this?
So those two questions, if we could start with Sarah, then Sunder.
Monica, in relation, and I'm going to try to take both questions. Probably more. I think yes, you know, integrating action. I think that's the do bit of our think and do tank. Is something that we're very excited about. How we do that in our policy labs, where it's not just about linking it to policymakers. It's working with practitioners. It leans into the way in which we combine expertise with lived experience, which we define to include the experience of practitioners, people who work on issues. And I think we've had some very good, some really encouraging experience of doing that in our work on poverty, where our policy lab, you know, we research findings that then inform really very practical interventions, like developing trainings around intercultural competence and communication, developing new resources for service providers to provide, enabling and equipping them to provide better service to migrant clients, where our research showed that they were struggling, and that those struggles to provide that level of advice to migrant clients meant that families facing poverty were not getting the support they needed. We tend to replicate that on these issues. That's 2 years out. I can't give you the details on that, but I think that there are ways to do that iteratively, to do the in-depth. I really resonated with Sunder's work about, some of that is about building trust and relationships, to have the kinds of open conversations about challenges, and then going back to checking. People will tell you, oh, this is the barrier. You go back and check that, come back to them about, well, you say this is not working, they say that's not working because of this, and actually really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of solving problems. I think that's one of the things that we really pride ourselves on doing. We've seen being quite effective, so I'm excited about doing that on this set of issues. In terms of research teams encountering resistance, again, Angela, it's a little bit too early to say. Certainly, we are aware and cognizant of that between writing our application and applying this research. We will be using peer researchers. We will be thinking much harder than we expected to about how we keep those teams of researchers safe, how we make sure that the kind of communications that will come out of our project, which will be ongoing. There are major reports at the end that we're expecting, blogs, relationships with local journalists, all that kind of activity. And it's a much more complicated and fractious landscape to work in. And all I can say is that we're going to try and think very, very hard about that and make as good choices as we can. Thank you.
You face some resistance sometimes, but actually often you face ambivalence as much as resistance. And I think the reason there's ambivalence now about race is at a time when the society is becoming more diverse and we're going to have to do more, act more, think more about it. There's more anxiety about getting it wrong, what it feels like to get it wrong, what work you need to have done before you can even start and so on, which I think can be quite paralysing sometimes, I think, for institutions that really would benefit from starting to act, learning, making the odd mistake, but getting somewhere. So actually how you diffuse that ambivalence, and the EDI question is of this nature. There's a backlash in America. I've had some private conversations, so large groups of quite senior corporates. There's going to be a bit more fence-sitting. There's a group that's strongly in favour. There's a smaller group that's strongly against. There's a lot more questioning of it, and there'll be some retrenchment. If people retrench too far, they don't have to be very political, but they should be defending the stuff that is good to being a good business. And so if they retrench too far, people will pick up, including their young staff, that we only do it when it's fashionable, but don't expect us to carry on when it's different. So how you get that right? But if people talk in words, not acronyms, if people talk about fairness, respect, equality, what they're expected to do, you can unlock some of that fence sitting. Some of that fence sitting is latent hostility, but some of it is good faith questions. And I think there's a danger that people will hide under the table when the heat is up, so we have to turn the heat down. Sometimes also show people how to navigate polarisation.
Just in terms of defence, so my project didn't begin until January, so I can't speak to this project. I do know from other work that, I'd say there's a difference between generalised ambivalence and a specific anxiety. The generalised ambivalence being one that comes from state and public sector workers under a lot of pressure. Limited resources, a compressed time, great deal of work in the workload. So just getting them to make time to sit down and talk is quite challenging. But then there's a specific anxiety about saying the wrong thing and or revealing that they're doing the wrong thing in terms of what they're actually doing. And some of the best research I feel that we've been able to do in the past has been one where civil servants in particular have been comfortable making or sharing mistakes and not feeling that we are going to put them in the firing line for it. And that only comes with mutual trust built up for a period of time. And that's part of the nature of research. Part of the nature of research that you can't train for, you have to learn it as you go, accumulate that trust. And I know there was a question as well about social dynamics and beyond policy. My project is specifically beyond policy, so in a way it's kind of it inverts the focus there. I want to begin with policymakers, partly because I'm arguing we haven't in these other contexts necessarily understood ways. Okay.
Great.
And I'm really sorry, we're going to have to be fairly brief.
Okay, very quick. So very quickly on the resistance, yes, there is resistance. There always has been. Runnymede is an old organisation, older than me, older than most of you, I imagine. And there have been very, very bad times in the past, and things have got worse in many ways now. But there are ways of dealing with it and preparing for it, which we are taking into account, thinking about safety, thinking about moving forwards. That's important. When it comes to action beyond policy, yes, I think that's incredibly important. Runnymede is also a very policy-focused organisation, and that's what we're good at. And I think policy matters. Policy is the reason why I took 2 weeks off when my children were born and my wife took 4 to 5 months off. It's the reason why you know how long your annual leave is. It's the reason why there's a minimum to how much you can be paid. It's the reason why if you have 2 children, you can get benefits and 3 you can't. This policy matters. And I understand that your question is very important. And that's why we're working with communities. That's why we're doing the engagement stuff. That's why we're getting all of those combined community-driven visions about what we should do next. And we think that's also incredibly important. And I want to hear that and acknowledge the importance of that. But I don't want to in any way shunt away the policy because we really care about it. And we think we have good reasons to really care about it.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry that there are some of you in the room and online who can't ask a question. But please remember what I said earlier about we want to hear those questions, we want to hear your comments. So do let us have those and do talk to us later as well. I hope that hearing from these 4 first people funded by RDUK has whetted your appetite for hearing more over the next few years, and so that you will keep in touch with us. And you know, it's absolutely fascinating. We want to know what to find out. Please join me thanking them for voting. Please stay. Before we take a break, I just want us to pick up one of the most sort of pressing issues in the contemporary landscape. People have really alluded to it so far. I'm speaking, of course, about migration policy. And we're very lucky to have on the Nuffield Trust Board and on the RDUK steering group a member whose experience on and expertise on migration in Britain are absolutely germane to current political preoccupations in the UK. Brian Bell is Professor of Economics at King's Business School, and for this particular purpose, I want you to think about the fact that he has worked at the Migration, I'm going to say Observatory, Migration Advisory Committee for the last few years and chairs it now. Okay, so thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Very useful to get your copies in time. So, of course, migration is only one element of what RDUK is interested in, but it's a really important element. And I was just reminding myself today of the statistics that if you look at England and Wales census for 2021, there are just under 11 million people who identify as non-white in the census of England and Wales. And remarkably, it's almost perfectly divided 50-50 between those who were born in the UK and those who came as first-generation immigrants. And of course, if you add in second and third-generation immigrants, you obviously get a significant majority of that group. And so migration policy is directly linked with racial diversity in the UK. And I think what I'd like to kind of just highlight is the Home Secretary has been very busy this week. I thought what she'd been saying is really interesting, and I think it can be quite helpful to think about how RDUK and the sort of work that we intend to fund going forward can actually really help think about that policy. And what's been interesting, I think, this week is that the Home Secretary has focused on an area of immigration policy that actually we haven't really focused on at all for quite a long time. So we're pretty used to Home Secretaries seemingly randomly changing visa routes by the week, by the year, whenever they fancy it, if numbers get a bit too high or a bit too low. And that's been a pattern we've seen for years and years. But interestingly, rules about settlement have actually stayed very stable for a long time. So they changed a bit in 2012, but actually since then it's really been very stable for most of the rules. And the rules have always been pretty straightforward. Is that once you've been here on most routes, once you've been here 5 years, as long as you haven't done anything wrong, you can apply for settlements. And actually, most people do, And the reason they don't tends to be it's just very expensive. So it's £3,000 at the moment to obtain settlements. So where we see people not choosing to get settled in the UK once they've hit the 5-year point, it's usually just about money, which is of course really important. But the Home Secretary is suggesting something completely different. She's now suggesting that we think about contribution in doing that. And I think kind of here, whether you agree or not with what she's proposing, and there's a consultation being launched today on it, I think there's real gaps in the research and sort of the evidence that we have that would be really helpful in thinking about this. And you can sort of see it in the proposals that are made. The proposals are pretty clear, and there are actual numbers in there for anything to do with economics. So we're pretty good at saying, here's a rule that we're going to have about how many years you have to do to get settlement if you earn this amount of money. And it's really detailed. It's like, it turns out £50,270 is the crucial number that you have to have if you want to get settled quicker under these proposals. So economics, we're sort of quite good at. And I think that's partly because we can just measure things well. We can measure wages, we can measure employment and that kind of thing. So zero, employment's 0 or 1, you either work or you don't. But the Home Secretary wants it to be about contribution to Britain. And she definitely thinks of that as broader than just economics. But then it becomes a bit waffly and vague in the proposals. I think this is where really kind of lots of work needs to be done in thinking about how you contribute and how you integrate into the UK if you come from abroad. If your main thing is not highly paid work. And so, for example, the proposals today talk about volunteering. And there's a very clear recognition that volunteering can be just as important, if not more important, than earning a lot of money, and that they are both important things that could lead to, as it were, faster settlement. But nothing more is said about it, it's just volunteering. But presumably what the Home Secretary doesn't really mean is if you happen to sing in a local choir, that will offset 5 years of earning £50,000 a year. But we don't know what it means, and you can imagine the problems that that's going to cause in terms of there'll be a whole cottage industry created of someone certifying you're a volunteer so that you get there. Clearly the government doesn't want that. More broadly, past volunteering, there's this broad question about what is integration for a migrant who has come to the UK on a visa. How do we measure that? And in some sense, I'm an economist, so I want things to measure things. But in some sense, we have to measure these things because we have to have rules. I mean, the alternative is we just say, oh, and a civil servant in the Home Office will decide whether you've integrated or not. It's probably not the best outcome, I think. So you are going to have rules to do that. And I think there's a real opportunity here for RDUK and for researchers to think about how you can help think about those more difficult aspects or the things that are hard to measure but are really important. Because I think the government are saying they think they're really important. And I think the challenge is how do you actually turn that into an operational policy? Because if not, I think the risk is you end up with a tick box exercise about money. And that will be a real disadvantage, not only for the UK, but also obviously for those affected under the proposals.
You see there in that short presentation the difficulties faced by any migration advisory committee in trying to produce independent evidence-based research, but also the openings potentially for us here in RDUK to think about issues that can potentially have an impact on the government, potentially. Anyway, we haven't got time to ask questions to Brian, but if you're interested in all these issues and you haven't yet signed up to be part of our community of interest, then please do so on the website. You'll find a link there. And you are now going to get a short break. So
in this part of the afternoon, what we want to do is to focus on the historical question that lies at the heart of our UK, which is how the legacies of migration and settlement from the colonies, from the Commonwealth, speak to the possibility of a just and inclusive future, but also how they somehow get in the way of that just and inclusive future. We said earlier on, these legacies have made the UK irreversibly plural and diverse, ethnically and culturally, almost in every respect, but they come with a kind of a paradox, which is they question the nativist premise wholeheartedly, but they also justify the nativist premise as we're seeing today. We're far too diverse. We need to go back to being less diverse is something that we hear all the time, appallingly. So either way, whichever side of the political spectrum you find yourself in, we have to acknowledge that these legacies, this history is formative. It really has been formative. It simply cannot be ignored. We need to stay with this history in general, but also in the context of RDUK. And we need to consider what kind of repair and restitution might come from this history. Its institutional history, the history of arrival, the history of settlement, the history of discrimination. We need to consider how this history can be constructively acknowledged. And don't we need plenty of that in our time? And what can be learned from this history? So there are all sorts of presences from the past, which we simply cannot do away with. And to help with this conversation, I'm delighted, really, I mean that, I'm delighted to welcome three experts whose work in so many different ways has been absolutely foundational. We have Catherine Hall, long and influential voice in feminist history, post-colonial studies, and the history of empire, and who had absolutely pioneered work on the detail and flows of British slave ownership. We have Sathnam Sanghera, whose two books, Empire Land and Stolen History, have in so many different ways altered and enhanced public understanding of what modern Britain's roots in imperial history, not least because of the different televisual forms that are flowed from this history. And we heard earlier on in the conversation with Sathnam arrived, this has also come at considerable personal cost. We have Rupinder Parhar, who in her role as head of equalities at the GLA, and various other past policy positions, has worked assiduously to tangibly improve the rights and chances of migrants, asylum seekers, and racialized groups, with always an eye to that historical legacy. So what we've done is we've asked Catherine, Sathnam, and Rupinder in turn to speak for 8 minutes each, after which we'll have a brief panel discussion. I'll put a question or two to each one of them, and then we will open up the Q&A until just before 5 p.m. or at 5 p.m. So, Catherine.
I think I will go over there, even though
Catherine, do you need
it's just slightly less nerve-wracking. No, I only need this one. Thank you. I'm not used to speaking for 5 to 8 minutes. It's very testing, I can tell you. And I'm sure I'll keep my eye on you. So, well, I'm a historian, and I don't do policy, but I hope that the work that we have been doing collaboratively, many of us over many decades by now, does help to inform policymakers. So I suppose, you know, this session is about the question of history and why history matters. But the major threat, as I see it, to racial and social justice at this point, at this conjuncture, where we are now, is reform. And that's what we have to address centrally, as well as all the other work that we have to do. And Reform's slogan, one of their beloved slogans is, "We want our country back." And that speaks to, of course, all those feelings about being left behind, about deindustrialization that we were hearing about what's happened to white men's work, or what's happened to de-skilling, about what feelings of displacement there are, about the decline of older communities. It speaks, there are so many different elements, as we know. There was a fascinating new piece of research about the support for reform from Hope Not Hate, which just makes it clear what a complicated alliance it is, how there is not one single thing that holds people together. Nevertheless, this slogan, "We want our country back," seems to me one that speaks particularly to the question of race and to the question of whiteness, and to a desire for exclusion, not inclusion. So how are we to respond to this? This conviction that others, all those others, are doing better than the traditional white communities who are facing the great replacement fear and the rage and envy and hate that this can produce. The reference back to the time when Britain was great and when Britain, quotes, ruled the world. So the reference back, of course, to the British Empire and the loss of empire and the huge question that has left for everybody in the UK as to what Britain is. Now it's no longer that. It's clearly no longer that. What is it? And obviously Brexit was, you know, absolutely can only be understood in that in that context. That sense of we're a sovereign island, you know, close our borders, keep ourselves safe, keep out everybody that you possibly can keep out. So how then can we respond to this as historically? How do we undo that sense? Well, of course, we've been dealing with that question for a mighty long time. And it takes me back to that really important slogan, vision of the, I can't even remember whether it was, whether it was the 70s, probably the 70s. We are here because you were there. We are here because you were there. That's the reason why this society has this particular characteristic. And even, it's not just Caribbean people, it's not just South Asian people. You know, when you look at what's happening in Sudan and you go back to the colonial history and you look at the ways in which the British fostered division between Arab people and African people of African descent, I mean, colonialism has so much to answer for. It can make one despair, but it also makes us think we simply have to grasp and understand as much as we possibly can. So, and of course we know that thinking about post-45 migration is only the beginning of it. We know there have been other peoples here for, you know, people would say since Roman times, forever and ever and ever, who have played an extremely important and complicated place in Britain's history, in that history of exploitation and territorial land grabbing and possession and power and what empire has meant. I've just been doing some, I didn't know I was going to say this, but a new bit of work that I've been doing is on the development of private property and the whole idea that private property has a history, which seems, I mean, it's kind of unimaginable now because of course there's always been private property. Well, there hasn't. There hasn't. And the way in which private property became established in England through enclosure, in Ireland and in Jamaica in the 17th century through colonialism, these are really important stories. The ways in which the claim for the ownership of land became central to an English identity. And just think how that's been played on, actually, over generations, the sense of the Englishman's castle, the Englishman's right to own property, which is such a different history from France, which has not had the same history, for example, of private property ownership. That's just one little piece that I've just been connecting. But when we came to think, look, that's about 4 minutes. Five. Okay. Well, when we started to think about how to undo this picture of empire and its greatness and so on, and how to bring race home to Britain, what we started working on was what became the Legacies of British Slave Ownership database, which was the database which uses all the strategies that I think it was Keon was talking about. We have an interactive map. We have loads of quantitative evidence. We did public engagement. We made television programs. We worked with communities. We did all that, but we did a huge amount of concrete empirical work to demonstrate the ways in which people in Britain were involved in the slavery business, either through slave ownership directly or through systems of credit, the whole development of finance capitalism, which has some of its many roots in the period of Atlantic slave trading and slave ownership. And that project has been utilized worldwide, actually, but of course, most of all here, by educationalists, by community groups, because what we've done is demonstrate how these practices of involvement in slavery permeated the whole society. And that involved the transmission of wealth through slavery, but it also involved the transmission of racial thinking, of the assumption that Black people were different, that they were not fully human, and that you could expect them to work for white people, which goes so deeply and which was fully established by the end of the 17th century. So just remember that. So what this has taken me to for my last minute in these last years is the whole question of how to connect patterns of racialization, the different patterns of racialization, and the different patterns of capitalist organization. What is the relation between race and capitalism? How are we to work this out, both for the past and the present? You know, being a historian now is absolutely centrally rooted in the notion that the past is not past. The past is living on with us in the present in all these ways, through capital flows and through people's minds and ways of thinking and imagining who they are. And you probably won't have noticed, but in some of the 2020 Black Lives Matter demonstrations, people were holding up placards saying, "Abolish racial capitalism." And I think to myself, I wonder if they know what that really is. There's a lot of work to be done, thinking through what the articulation is between different forms of racialization in different, I mean, it's different even across Britain when you look at different areas and the organisation of labour, for example, and the way it plays into different patterns of racialization. So much work to be done there, but it takes us to the whole question of the structures as opposed to the surfaces. And the problem with so much of the work, so much of the excellent work that's been done in the wake of 2020 in order to try and repair, you know, in the Bank of England, in the Church of England, in universities, in schools. I mean, I could give you a list of literally over 100 organizations that are doing repair work. But who addressed the question of structure and the way in which racialization is locked into contemporary forms of organization and social hierarchy and labor and the economy? And that's the work that needs doing most of all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Am I speaking next? There
You are.
I didn't realize I was speaking to a room of experts. So this is probably incredibly obvious and to you guys, also an ineloquent version of what Kathleen just said. Feel free to have your afternoon nap. This is probably when I fall asleep, if it'll count down on Channel 4. won't be offended. But I'm going to basically echo what Catherine said. You know, Britain has long struggled to accept the historical imperial explanation for its racial diversity. The idea that black and brown people are aliens who arrived here without permission to take advantage of the British has been the defining narrative, I think, of all our lifetimes, and it seems to be intensifying. It was famously, of course, propounded by my local MP, Enoch Powell. We were lucky to have him in Wolverhampton. But it continues now, continues in the 21st century, in the way public figures are regularly told to go home on social media. At the moment, Sunder's doing amazing work, kind of classifying and accounting for all the ways in which people of colour on Twitter and X are told to F off on a daily basis. But also it's echoed in the way we talk about second generation immigrants. And the phrase, that for me makes no sense, no sense. Either you're an immigrant or you're not. What is a second generation immigrant? I think we do ourselves disservice by using that phrase. It's echoed in the way in which Shamima Begum had her citizenship removed. I don't see white people having their citizenship removed. It's echoed, of course, in the Windrush scandal, where people who arrived here before 1973, and particularly those of Caribbean origin, were refused benefits, had their legal rights removed, and were deported. Again, I don't see that happening to white people of immigrant background even. Also, it's become a mainstream claim on the right to suggest that people of colour can't be English. It's been applied recently to Rishi Sunak. I think rather bizarrely, Suella Braverman has said it about herself. I don't know what that means, but she said it, doesn't she? Yeah. Someone can ask her what she means. I'd be. But of course, lots of immigrant families, in my experience, have absorbed the narrative. I mean, my parents never packed away their suitcases. They were always there, and they resisted getting British passports. I had to beg them to apply for British citizenship. And I remember being told as a kid that you vote Labour if you wanted brown immigrants to stay, and you voted Tory if you wanted them to F off. And at school, this kind of idea was absorbed in the fact that, you know, I sat through tens of Remembrance Day services, and not once were we told, despite being a very diverse school, that millions of soldiers of colour, of our background, had fought in both world wars. It just never was mentioned. But the fact is that immigrants of imperial background were invited to come to this country. You very rarely hear that being acknowledged in a national narrative. Following the Second World War, you know, hundreds of thousands of Indian soldiers and their families were invited to come to this country. And it became clear that restarting the British economy would need a great surge of imperial labour, and the word quickly spread to the Caribbean and India and beyond. And in 1947, it was announced by the Ministry of Labour that 4,000 overseas workers would be introduced to Britain. And soon the NHS, as well as companies like London Transport, were advertising in the former imperial territories, sometimes even offering sweeteners in the form of travel fares. And of course, one of the ministers, the Minister of Health at the time, involved in driving NHS recruitment, was none other than, you probably know the answer, Enoch Powell. Yes. And health workers in Britain's former empire answered this appeal to such a degree that in 2003 it was claimed that in the Rhondda Valley in Wales, nearly 3/4 of all the GPs had South Asian origin. But some came as citizens, and this gets forgotten. The arrivals on the SS Windrush were nothing to do, actually, with this particular recruitment drive. It turns out that there was a half-empty ship, and the skipper put out a call to fill those spaces for £28 a berth. But at the time, we had the 1948 Nationality Act. I think this was the most important piece of post-war legislation we ever had. And it was an amazing piece of law. It basically made every citizen or subject of the British Empire a citizen of Britain, a crazy piece of legislation. It made 600 million people citizens of Britain. They didn't really think it through. What were they thinking? Basically, the idea was, you know, we just spent all those years fighting the evil racist Nazis, so therefore we probably couldn't be racist ourselves. There was a view that the empire could continue to exist and maybe racial discrimination would be a bad thing to do. But it's also that legislation came about mainly because the ties between Britain and the Empire were really deep, you know, they went back centuries. And I do believe that if we acknowledge this basic historical fact, it would transform our conversations on multiculturalism, which are often very, very stupid. In this debate about multiculturalism, almost all the pressure is put on immigrant communities to integrate, to pass citizenship tests, to learn English, to accept certain values. But the whole society is almost never discussed. I know Robert Jenrick, who unfortunately I was at school with, you know, never talk about how integration is a two-way street, you know, and part of that acknowledgement is just acknowledging that people of colour are here for deep historical reasons. The ties go way back, you know. There were black people in Henry VIII's court, in Henry VII's court. Queen Elizabeth was complaining about there being too many black people in London back in the 1600s. You know, the first Indian youth to be baptized was a Bengali boy. He was christened Peter Pope back in 1616. There was a black Londoner in Samuel Pepys's diaries in 1661. Dean Mohammed introduced curry to London in 1809. London was teeming with Asian seamen, known as Lascars, going back centuries. You had hundreds of Chinese and Indian women coming as ayahs to look after former imperial travellers. You had former slaves packing London. You could find brown people practicing as doctors, law students, actors, nurses, sportsmen, going back centuries. The first mosque, I always ask this question when I speak to primary school children. I say, when did the first mosque open in London? Now, you're experts. You should know this. You guys in particular. When did the first mosque open in Britain?
Opening Woking.
Yes, it was Woking. Are you Muslim? Have you been there?
In 1839, no.
1899. So much longer than you think.
1899.
Yeah, you're pretty close. The first Asian MP, I would have thought it was Keith Fass. When was the first Asian MP?
1892.
Exactly right. 1892. He was a Liberal MP for Central February. Anyway, my point is, this shit goes way back, right? And it's never acknowledged. It's not a new thing. Also, the racism goes way back. You know, American politicians, Australian politicians, South African politicians, and British politicians were all complaining about Asian migration back in the 19th century. They were exchanging letters and poems. They weren't exchanging policy on eggs like they do now. But pretty much it was the same thing. And history helps to illuminate these subjects. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You can stay here.
Okay. I am going to try and time myself. Okay. So, thank you for inviting me today. I am going to speak about, I could talk about work that I've done kind of making the case for changing the law and being part of running a city. But the thing I come back to a lot is why do we end up in the kind of situations that we're in often repeatedly, and what are the kind of trends and patterns that influence that? So I wanted to kind of run through some of that today, particularly in light of the things that have been announced by the Home Secretary today. So in order to consider the impact of Commonwealth legacies on contemporary migration, I think it's important for us to understand this current conjuncture and how the kind of competing social, political, ideological and economic forces come together to shape what we're seeing. You know, we've kind of talked about it several times today, the kind of crises, far-right growth, treatment of migrants, etc. I'm not going to be able to go into that in detail because I have 8 minutes. So I'm just going to piece some things together that I'm sure we can kind of pick up in discussions. Some people I know in this room will know this stuff really well. Hopefully it's kind of brings some things together in interesting ways for other people. So in light of the announcements from government this week on immigration and asylum changes, I think we are in a particularly pertinent moment to be kind of thinking about particular questions, some of which are not new, but are kind of helpful to think about in this moment. Specifically, how do we find ourselves in a situation where governments of different stripes, certainly since World War II, have developed a shared consensus which centres around a fairly punitive approach to managing migration and asylum. And there might be people in this room that disagree with me. I'm happy to pick that up in the Q&A. I don't think this is a coincidence, but a very consistent feature with an organising ideology and structural formation which kind of relates to how the state operates and the role that racism and racialisation play within that kind of structural formation of the state. So the kind of historical production of racialised outsiders, of which obviously migrants are kind of positioned as one group, happening in the post-war period, but certainly also prior to that. There was a woman earlier who raised kind of Irish travellers. You know, we see this kind of historically over the process of hundreds of years, Irish Catholic migrants, Jewish migrants, etc. It's very much a material process. It's not incidental. It's not only kind of forged through clashes with the far right. It's not only shaped by media. It is a kind of organising function of how our economy and our political systems work. So this week's immigration and asylum announcements from the Labour Party were not only kind of influenced by the Danish government, which was kind of the thing that was spoken about in the media. The 2015 Danish government came in and scoped these quite punitive immigration policies. You can also see resonance with the Labour government of '99. Some of us that work on immigration and asylum will know there was a very drastic piece of legislation that was introduced in '99 called the Immigration and Asylum Act, and it basically created a sort of parallel welfare state for asylum seekers and a few other kind of measures, including no recourse public funds, something which is personally my mastermind subject, but I will not bore you with that today. So when you look back on the debates from that piece of legislation on Hansard, you can see discussions playing out in Parliament around the particular measures of whether asylum seekers should have to hand over their assets when they come to this country to be eligible for state support. And that included their jewellery. So this thing that's again being kind of relitigated now over 20 years later. And interestingly, it's a new Labour, you know, it's a Labour government. Again, going back to this point that I make about how people of different political stripes go back to this shared consensus around punitive immigration policies. How is then this marginalisation of migrants in particular possible? We can look to the emergence of contemporary immigration exclusions, which are kind of predicated on this idea of shaping who are the outsiders. So those that exist on the edges of a nation and how this is played out through the entitlements and rights that they have and the kind of treatment that they face. Again, it's really important for us to understand that these things do not kind of form organically, they're not kind of incidental, there's a structural component to them. Obviously, one of the kind of features of today is talking about post-colonial migration. So during colonialism, these outsiders tended to obviously generally not be in the UK. Obviously, there is a kind of precedence of racialised people being within the UK, but generally they were an external periphery. The process of decolonisation brings these populations into the UK, so that kind of periphery and also that colonial encounter obviously plays out within towns and cities within the UK. As I say, there's kind of other historical precedents for migration of different communities, and there's a lot of parallels, particularly with Jewish migration and kind of the precedents that are set, including at the early 20th century and kind of how we're treating later migrant groups. Creating a nation then, and people who belong within that nation, is particularly important in the post-war period. Again, the idea of crafting who's in the nation and who belongs is also not incidental. There's particular reasons for doing that at particular moments. In the World War II post-war reconstruction period, obviously we've gone through a very significant event of crisis. Many people have died. We have a very kind of, the economic state of the country is quite poor. And there's a need to kind of resolve these multiple social, economic and political crises that are coming out of post-war decolonisation, this economic precarity, and the need to extract that ongoing wealth and labour power from the colonies as part of that reconstruction. And in this time, we see the development of the welfare state, which is only made possible through the wealth extracted from colonies, and there's other people that have written about that extensively. And this is founded, one of the kind of originating principles of it that emerges is that there are certain exclusions that are necessary. There are, to be fair, political disagreements that kind of play out about this at the time, including people that argue that we should just have universal provision and others that argue that we shouldn't. Obviously, over the years, what we've seen is it continues to be even more exclusion. Really quickly, and picking up some of the points that Catherine raised, I wanted to talk about how something like racial capitalism comes into understanding how this plays out and why it's important for thinking about migration, not only the kind of formation of race and the economics of the UK. So Cedric Robinson argues that capitalism relies on differentiation, but he doesn't kind of go into the specifics of what it means in a system and how it kind of plays out. That's picked up by people, including in South Africa and elsewhere, over the course of ensuing decades that tried to unpick, well, actually prior decades, but who tried to unpick what does it mean when a system is organised around racial capitalism. Stu Hall refers to how these modes of racial organisation are not simply coloured by race, they work through race. Race is the way that we manage kind of particular populations and can control them. Gargi Bhattacharya, who speaks about racial capitalism more recently, also describes it as a process by which capitalist formations create edge populations that serve as the other and a limit of the working class. And that comes into some of what was spoken about earlier around kind of the white working class. So there is a hegemonic consensus around a need to protect accumulation, particularly to prop up the state, due to the primacy of this economic system that we're living in, namely capitalism. There are practical ways this plays out that I can go into much detail about with people that are interested. But crucially, racial capitalism is reproduced through the separation and exploitation of different groups at different scales. So some groups are less deserving and some are more deserving of rights and protections and the riches of the society that we live in. It is race is produced through interaction with the state, so how racialized identities are also produced by the immigration system, by the welfare system. Again, there's many other people that have kind of written about that. And capitalism is always shaped by the particular histories and social relations that determine these exclusions. So really quickly, I'm sorry, I'm going over it. How is that relevant today? So we can continue to see how the migration system and racialization of migrants continues to draw new groups into these groups. So a really important thing that I'm sure many of us recognize is that racial identity is malleable, right? And people can fall in and out of entitlement depending on what the circumstances are that we're in as a society. Particularly as a state is kind of trying to resolve these particular crises depending on the conjuncture that we're in. It also draws in British people that are racialised as undeserving, family members of migrant groups, particular long-standing racialised communities who get racialised in negative ways. It's important to think about how their rights and the protections they face in society is also linked to migrants. This matters for all of us because of how migrants are a testing ground for punitive policies that are then played out against domestic populations. We see that playing out with ID cards, which are obviously first and are currently used for migrants. It's also evident in scaling back the welfare state, which first happened with the asylum system. It happens around scaling back civil liberties and welfare rights, etc. So that's why it matters for all of us. It also helps us to understand how narrative media discourse, while playing an important part in this material structure, are not the primary driving force. And I think that's an important thing to note when we think about the far right kind of pushing politics. Actually, there's a more complex kind of interplay happening there. And we can talk a bit about kind of how moral panics are created as a way of kind of offering these simple answers to very complex social challenges, namely it's the migrant who stole your job, etc. And crucially paving the way for government to introduce more authoritarian policies. So just to conclude, I wanted to just leave on the note of racism and racialization of migration is a structuring phenomenon that relates to how immigration controls are enacted in this country after the World War. The functioning of capitalism is always racialized, and we have to move away from understanding migration policy as simply dictated by media narrative or far-right political influence, but also kind of mediated through these more structural forces.
Thank you. I have to apologise. I think sending you this task and giving you 8 minutes is
I think it was totally unfair. Totally.
Really unfair. But you know, the ship must continue to sail. So I was going to ask each of you a question, and I want to just pose one question. And it's this. I mean, you've given us a really nuanced view collectively of how difficult history brings us to our present moment. And you, all three of you, I think, have touched on the conjunction today, very difficult conjunction of today. So my question is this: with this history in mind, from your own perspective, and given the now, And you've touched on some really difficult questions, such as the embedded consideration ethically. How do we begin to undo all of this? How do we make this history, turn this history into a generative project which will land in public and political culture? And I use the word land simply because there is no political party right now, big political party, that's even prepared to counter this system, this history. So what would you do? Is this a challenge of public culture? Is this a challenge of rewriting the history of nations in the UK? Is this a challenge of taking things back into school? Where would you begin? Because it seems to me that we're back at the kind of baseline yet again. As you wish.
Can you hear me? Well, I think we have to work at all those levels, and I think we have been doing for a long time, actually. And I think it has been generative. So I don't think we should despair, but it doesn't mean there isn't a very pressing set of issues now. So, you know, if you look at what we did with the legacies of British slave ownership database and the impact that that has had, and the numbers of institutions and individuals that have attempted, using that material, using that concrete evidence that we provided of the ways in which wealth was transmitted to particular people in particular places at a certain time. That is to say, the moment of the organisation of compensation to slave owners in 1834 after abolition. And you see how people have used that, how teachers have said to their kids, you know, let's look at Greater Liverpool, or I mean, I don't think there is such a thing as Greater Liverpool. So let's look at, you know, wherever we are at school, let's see on the map, where can we find the slave owners here? What kind of history is there here that we can hold on to? And the kids are excited because they can go to the local park and see that it's named after, you know, Edward Colston or whoever it might be. They can see the embedding of the history in their local environment. So I think, you know, that raises questions in people's minds. And I think we have to hope that that work of raising questions, of giving people new ideas, of telling new histories will reap benefits over time. Now, obviously, we face a particular set of we face a very hostile environment now. And we face a hostile environment where, as we know, it's being funded from the right to challenge every new piece of work that's being done, every new article that's written, every new television program that's produced, etc. And we also have very frightened institutions which are backing off. I mean, it's wonderful that Nuffield today is actually organising this new initiative, because when you look at the history of what has happened, for example, in many of the reparative projects in universities, they all terrified by, not just universities, the galleries, the museums, everywhere, terrified by 2020, thinking that Black Lives Matter, you know, huge crowds are going to be gathering to steal their pictures or knock down their statues or challenge their corporate organizations. And they're not frightened anymore. And what's more, now they're frightened of the right, and they're frightened of the way in which EDI type proposals are no longer the flavor of the month. So we face a very different, I mean, that's a huge change in 5 years, actually. In 5 years, there was a moment of opening up. There's now another moment of closure. But the history is, you know, these moments come and go, and the opportunities don't die. And I think educationally, we have to believe in the possibilities of all the grassroots organizations and changes that there are. And, you know, I hold on to the fact that the social attitude surveys tell us much more optimistic things than do any political parties, because the social attitudes tell us that people are more tolerant and that there's less pride in empire. I mean, really quite specific things like that. That is a big change. And that's on the ground. We've got to take our minds away from the politicians who are completely locked into the paranoid, toxic debates and work with what's going on the ground.
That's great. I was just going to say.
I know, it's too long, sorry, but you only gave me 7 minutes.
No, that's good. Let's go with the ground. Exactly my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that, and it's quite depressing at the moment, as someone who works on a right-wing newspaper, seeing how the right is now the far right. But actually, there are reassuring things, even in the recent history of Britain. You've got to remember that racial hatred can fade. I mean, you've got to remember that the target of Enoch Powell in Rivers Buzzspeech was a Sikh community. There's people like my parents. I'm Sikh. And actually, I don't detect a huge amount of hatred towards the Sikhs in particular nowadays. They are generally seen as almost you're Sikh as well, aren't you? A model immigrant community who've kind of integrated but kept some of their values. But 100 years before that, living in the same communities in Wolverhampton where we moved in, the Irish. They were accused of exactly the same things. They didn't integrate. They practiced a weird religion. They didn't speak the language. They were drunk. They created slums. Exactly the same accusations. And I would say that largely anti-Catholic, anti-Irish hatred has disappeared in that part of the world. So racial hatred can fade, and there is some comfort to be found in history, I think.
Fade or shift?
Shift. I'm not hatred. All of that hatred still exists, doesn't it? We heard some of it today. Yeah.
I was going to respectfully disagree that it just shifts. So the reason that particular South Asian communities are model minorities is because obviously other racialized communities are the kind of foil to that. So obviously Muslim communities being the kind of South Asian community of interest that that people want to kind of problematize. I mean, I guess I have the benefit of working in a public institution and getting to grapple with the practicalities of this question day to day. I think a lot of, what's been said is correct in terms of education. I think for me, the failures of post-2020 was that there were not efforts for genuine redistribution along, reparative redistribution. So that kind of effort was funneled into surface level kind of EDI initiatives, getting more people of colour in boardrooms, women, etc. That's the stuff that doesn't create change. Again, happy to have people disagree with me on that. But on the whole, it doesn't create a difference for the young black person that is criminalised, or those young people that were on those protests very often that were kind of the most disadvantaged by the system that we're in. The other thing I would say is, and maybe this is again controversial, I think we actually need to, one, really systematically denaturalize race and I think it's Keon, race is fake, right? So what does that mean practically? Of course, it means it has material impacts, but what does that mean for how we think about racialized communities, how we think about how they're constructed, and understand that construction can kind of shift over time? That's important for us to then think about what is kind of possible in challenging racism. The other thing that I think is really important is actually, again, maybe controversial, denaturalizing being able to say things are racist. It's fine that things are racist. I will never turn around and say a person is not racist. That's not true. We live in a racist society. It's, as we all know, it's more damaging to say that someone or something is racist than to do the racism. I think that is a problem. We need to be able to move away from being able to just say, from that kind of threat that's posed. And again, I think that's kind of intentionally constructed. So yeah, some things I think would help.
So there are several provocations, but we have 20 minutes for Q&A. 10 minutes.
Oh, is it
5?
Sorry.
No, that's just fine. Okay. Please do say who you are. I know who you are, but say who you are.
Is this working? Can you hear me?
No.
Just level. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So my name is Tariq Jazil, and I'm based at University College London. Thank you for this panel, and I guess I wanted to a question for, I think it's for Nuffield, really, because facilitated by the comments of this panel, particularly Catherine and Rupinder. far right. And I guess I'm interested, I mean, we're at a particular moment where whiteness is kind of crystallizing in particular kinds of ways, really interesting kinds of ways. And I guess I'm interested in this kind of program of research. I mean, if you're working on anti-racism at the moment, you're interested in what's going on the far right, right? So I guess I'm interested in whether Nuffield are sort of interested in research that is going to explore those kinds of formations, because I think they're incredibly important for understanding public understandings of racial diversity, phrase racial diversity at the moment. So it's a question about what we do research-wise with the far west at the moment.
Let's take two more. One from the floor and one offline.
Thank you so much. My name is Rana Khatwak. I work at the University of Oxford. My question is for Rupinder, and I'm really glad that you were talking about the structures, and I'm convinced with everything you said about EDI and all these surface level measures. So my question is, given you work for the GLA, and I guess building on the same question about where do we start with this changing these structures, where do you see your role, given that you work in the GLA, understanding how then within London, for example, there's so many of these structures that are creating all of these racial inequalities, which, I mean, thinking about housing, about employment, so many other things. Where do you see your role and the role of the GLA in breaking some of these structural dynamics?
Anything online?
No, there's nothing coming through online.
Okay. And with the back there.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
No.
No. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Great. Okay, thanks, Nuffield, for organizing this fantastic event.
No.
And
Sorry, I'll try this.
Right.
Instead.
Maybe my question is unnecessary. But thanks to the panel as well. My only is whether comment or observation. I can speak loud.
Third mic.
Third mic.
Third mic.
Don't press it.
Just hold it up.
Can you guys hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So thanks very much for an insightful discussion, and everything the panel said resonates with me so much. My name is Maninate. I represent Baxpa University here. From experience perspective, after serving in the British Army for 17.5 years, and living with PhD as a private, I do not think anyone has taken Britain anywhere. It still belongs to the British, right? So it's quite premature for this argument to be surrounding us at the moment. And my point resonates with what Catherine is saying. In the Britain and also serving in the army, we have reaped the benefit of diversity. But when it comes to policy and it comes to initiative, we are yet to understand what it means, and we are yet to recognize that diversity is actually a gift that needs to be celebrated. This is something that is missing. The second part is also the systematic barriers at institutional level and also fill up into the national level. How do we address those systematic barriers that even prevent institutions from implement EDI? Because some institution, EDI is just a tick and box exercise. So those culture changes, how do we do that? How do we ensure there's an issue, the issue of culture, inclusion, and belonging need to be addressed from both sides, because that created an issue. And then talking about policy on migration, it's very, very important for us to understand the implication that has at national level as well. So thank you, that's my question.
Thank you. Tariq, I'm going to park your question to the Nuffield for a minute, because I'm very keen to engage with all of you. And so one of the questions there has to do with what are the limitations of EDI, what can the authority like GLA do, how do we overcome institutional barriers, all three of them. say something on that question.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
I should have prefaced this with my views are not views of my employer, etc., etc. Yeah, so it is worth stating because obviously, you know, I work within a kind of political structure and I have my own thoughts and feelings about things too. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, again, it's something I kind of grapple with every day. I lead a team that works on kind of equality policy. So kind of you were speaking about equalities legislation. So really practically, legally, what are the things that we have to do and what's kind of possible to kind of push within that. The other half of my team actually works specifically on racialized disparities in the labour market. So trying to create basically job opportunities for people that are most marginalised, which is Black people, Pakistani women and Bangladeshi women. I mean, I have a lot of ideas on how we can kind of change those systems. One of them is actually in a London level, we have quite few levers. We have quite limited power. And again, that was a kind of intentional decision around devolution that happened several decades ago. Again, partly shaped by a Labour government about not wanting kind of cities like London to go off and become their own republic, no matter how much some of us in the room would want that to happen. So I think there's something about actually, do we even have the power to do certain redistributive things? There is a conversation that's happening at a national government level about how does devolution happen differently. Really practically, there are literally certain things that we can't do. As I say, work around kind of genuine social redistribution. Yeah, part of that is about people being able to get jobs. Part of that is the real basics around people being able to access housing that isn't poor quality or full of mold or even, you know, that isn't available to them in the first place. Part of that is also about setting up young people you know, through education and through early life. I think, I mean, there's so many things, but the kind of fundamentals that restrict us currently, as I say, is the limitations of a political system that we're in. And then that kind of coming back to the prevailing ideology, namely of racial capitalism, where we are governed by scarcity, and you know that the idea that you have to have certain people that do less well in a system, and you have certain people that can benefit. That's the fundamental kind of governing ideology that I think is inherently a problem, and you can only do so much within that sort of kind of dominant frame.
Okay, I'll just pick up on one thing that I said about diversity being a gift. I totally believe that. And I was totally into the London 2012 Olympics, which I think was the peak of that idea of diversity being a gift. But I also think there was a massive PR educational failure that not all people felt included in that message. You saw it on the night of the ceremony, of the opening ceremony of the Olympics, where certain MPs were complaining, saying, this is not my Britain, what is this about, I don't recognise this. And I think we failed to sell the idea that everyone has diversity in them. If you're white, you have some diversity in you. We failed to include diversity in the national story. So our national narratives, or Henry VIII, World War I, World War II, there were diverse aspects to all those stories, you know, the millions of soldiers, the resources of empire. You never hear that. You never hear the empire included in the national story. So I think there's an educational PR failure in selling that idea of diversity. It wasn't inclusive enough, ironically.
That's what you want to add something?
No, I mean, of course, you're right that despite all the work and all the museum exhibitions and all the, you know, everything that everybody's done, it still hasn't had the power that we want it to have. We haven't really undone the national narrative in the way that we need to. But I can't comment on that. I mean, I'm not any longer in an institution. I can see all the things that are wrong with, that are limited about the policies, but as to how any of that is going to be transformed, I mean, the current situation in higher education is so dire in so many ways, and the disparities and inequalities, you know, I mean, I'm watching people who are ordinary lecturers and what have you in universities having their teaching hours doubled, their research time taken away, being made redundant. I mean, it's a really, really serious situation. Well, meanwhile, the top layer go on having these enormous salaries. I mean, the inequality in universities is absolutely embedded. So it's just, you know, that's never speaking about EDI or any of that. So there's a lot to be done.
Thank you.
I do want to make a comment about whiteness. Can I just do that?
Sure.
I mean, it's very interesting the ways in which whiteness is being reworked, reconfigured at the moment. But I heard somebody the other day, and I wish I could remember who it was, somebody, you know, who I respect, sort of saying, reform has allowed white identity to be claimed as an issue. And I thought white identity has been there, you know, for such a long time. You know, the recent research that I've done, which is in my book, which is called Lucky Valley, which is about England and Jamaica in the 18th century. And Edward Long, who is the great historian of Jamaica, is describing in detail the construction of white with a capital W and Negro with a capital N identities. He is as concerned as a slave owner with what it means to be white, with the associations with freedom and liberty, these things which have actually been part of a whole history of whiteness in this country. And as with all these issues, we need the history as well as the present. We need to look at the ways, the reconfigurations that are constantly taking shape as the society changes, as the economy changes, as the politics changes. We're working with a long, long history of racialization in this society.
Thank you. Sorry, your question was not real. Let me start the beginning of an answer and then invite Kevin, the executive, if you want to say something. The fact that we're doing RDUK and we've launched a new strategic program, which is all about inclusion, justice, and recognizing all the things that get in the way, I think the consequence of that is that we're bound to want to work the far right. How could we not? Not necessarily as a program on the far right, but research on the far right, whether it's a strategic initiative or grant applications to the foundation, or in the coattails of something like RDUK, or also one of our primary themes is going to be trusted institutions, how can politics be made to work positively. I just don't think we can ignore this topic. Amin, did you want to add a quick thought?
Let's just check this microphone works. Can people hear me? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Ash, and thank you for the question. Sorry, I agree, Ash. I mean, just take a step back. We are interested here in, well, inequalities and discrimination. We're also interested in social change, the forces that drive social change, and the forces that create alienation. Given that context, you can't not be interested in the far right and what it's doing and where it's come from and where it's going. So I think at that level, of course we are, otherwise we're not doing a job. We haven't got a specific program, as Ash says, on that, but we need to figure out, and we're in the kind of foothills of figuring out where we take not only RDUK, but our wider strategy. And this will be one question we have to think about.
That's great. We're time moving very, very rapidly. Shall we do another quick round of questions, 2 from the floor and 1 online, if there is one online?
Hi, my name is Tonic Betu, social anthropologist at UCL. 1, 2, 3, can you hear me? Is that now? Okay, so my name is Tonic Betu. I'm a social anthropologist at University College London. Thank you for hosting this event. It's refreshing to hear of the work of RDUK. I don't know how to frame my question without it coming across a little acerbic, and it's not intentional, but I am what I am. What's the best way to phrase this? Okay, no, I know. Last night I was at an event, police event, consultation event in Hackney, where I live. There's around 100 participants, 50 police officers, talking about racism, justice issues and social justice and change. And everyone was, cheering, patting themselves on the back about the good work that the Met's trying to do now. I sat there, having been a scholar activist for most of my adult life, and realised that all the policy agendas and all of the priorities were being set by people in that audience who had no lived experience of the racism faced by people of African heritage. They were well-intentioned people, but their concerns were e-bikes, e-scooters, drugs being sold in pubs, nothing to do with identification, stop and search, and all the issues like facial recognition that affect me, my family, my children, my community. And so while I'm sitting here and I'm really, the nerdy part of me is really loving it. Of course it is. I mean, some great discussions. There's another side of me, which is very much about where is the voice of those grassroots communities? Where are those African people with Caribbean heritage, with continental heritage, who are now rapidly being sidelined from research projects, discussions like this, where we are the source of ethnographic data, but not of expertise about radical approaches to new changes. So where are we going to find them? Where do we stop perpetuating this problem, where we see ourselves as the experts of those who are at the brunt of our failings? Because that's the experience I have. I come to university, I've been part of the institution for only 4 years. I've been an activist for the rest of that life. And as I'm looking at research opportunities and looking at priorities and the things that filter you out for these kind of things, I'm starting to recognize, be sure, I get that. No, this is part of it. I kind of recognize that those priorities don't quite align with those uncomfortable discussions that we need to have. And so while it is refreshing to hear about looking at the problems of discrimination faced by travellers, I would argue that those faced by Africans with Caribbean heritage, for example, we talked about the Windrush, but it's not just the Jamaican communities, the Trinidadians, the Commonwealth. Those narratives are now being pushed away as Windrush Part 2, which is what the Home Secretary is doing, is actually bringing forward. So it's a big question. I'm sorry, I didn't know how to frame it in every way, but I thought this should be a safe space to have intellectual engagement with these issues.
And it is a safe space to make that very urgent comment. Thank you. Shall we take another question or a comment?
Hello, my name is Cynthia Wikiri. I'm from University of East Anglia. Thank you very much. I wanted to comment on the last speaker about how race is malleable, and I wanted to kind of contest that just a little bit. If you are close to whiteness, so if you have light skin, light colored skin, and you have silky hair, you can say that race is malleable. But if you're black, it isn't. You will never not be picked out in the middle of white people or people with lighter skin. And I just wanted to highlight that because that's something that whoever you are, how wealthy you are, how cultured you are into white Western European cultures, if you are black, you remain like that. And you will always find yourself at some point. And so I wanted to just say that race in that sense is quite rigid for black people. And then secondly, I wanted to turn racism on its head, because when we talk about identity and we try to get social workers, because that's how I trained, to think about identity and culture, we don't always think about why it's important for black people. And Professor Hall talked about it, that the reason it's important is that black people, even now, who they are is still being questioned, whether they have what it takes to be human. And this man who just died recently, the founder of DNA, Watson, talks about that black people can never attain what white people can because genetically black people are inferior. And these things go way back to history, Hegel, all the people who are top philosophers in Europe had the same view. So it's all still in the system. And so I want to then, but then something's quite interesting. Bywater's research, sorry I'm taking time, I just needed to get this off my chest. Bywater's research talks about white working class boys as being the people who are left behind academically. And when they do that, they problematize it it's about poverty, it's about economics and all of that. And that's right. But what it misses is that before it used to be black boys who were so inferior genetically. So I want to ask, have white boys now become inferior genetically? That's what I want to ask, because that's a way to think about it, that it's no longer about genes and all those things that still form the foundations.
Thank you. I'm sorry to cut you short, but I'm so acutely conscious of time now. Is there a very quick question
It's a
online?
very quick question online from Benefer Bandari at the Anti-Racism Observatory of Scotland, who is challenging the panelists' use of the phrase ethnic minorities and asking whether ethnically minoritized as an act would be a more appropriate way to express this.
Okay, so at the end of the day, I think we've touched on some really big questions, which are profoundly important. And they're really about blackness and home. Blackness is a kind of condition that you can't escape from. Blackness potentially as another way of living your life, but constantly forgotten and ignored by most who make decisions and purport to be experts. And then we've had this clarification about ethnically, that a better use of term might be ethnically minoritized. I'd like to give the last word to all three of you. Any thought that you have? Or I think what have been two really quite comments which have really pushed us far. Thank you for your comments. Okay, who wants to go first?
I can go. Thank you for that challenge. I was kind of truncating it. Racial categories are malleable, and we do have in the UK a history of people that fall in and out of inclusion. Jewish communities being a very obvious example of people that were marginalised by immigration policy and face pogroms in this country and face different types of discrimination. Not to say they don't face racism now, but it's different. The other thing, and without kind of going on a tangent about this, one of the places that complicates this idea that simply being proximate to a particular phenotype makes you kind of more or less racially discriminated against is the Caribbean. So, you know, and I'm sure you know that in terms of the history of coolies and others and people that were brought to the Caribbean and are not, you know, don't have the same kind of protections or historically didn't have the same protections. But I take your point. I guess I mean, I was talking about categories. There is obviously the phenotypes of particular groups that can't be changed, and I totally hear that. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. The problem with a lot of this work is like things fall in and out of interest. Like we've been talking about this post-2020 wave where people like don't care about particular issues anymore. They're not getting the kind of coverage. They're not getting the funding. One of the reasons why the Windrush so-called kind of scandal happened is because people were like not kind of intentionally understanding the impacts of particular policies or willfully allowed particular things to happen. So yeah, I think you're right. And on policing in particular, I mean, again, my views are not using my employer. I'm often in conversations around policing with people, including people in this room, who are like, we do not want to talk about this stuff with you anymore because we are sick of saying the same things again and again and again. I don't think I said ethnic minority because but the point that raises is something that I have to kind of like relitigate day to day in my job, which is language is imperfect, terminology is imperfect, and while it is important to be careful and we should think about how we can adapt the things that we say, I promise you, no one is ever happy. I have never encountered anyone being happy with a kind of singular term. So yeah.
Okay, so
I guess I would echo that. And the language of all of this is constantly changing. In the 5 years I've been writing my empire, for example, in my empire land, I talked about slaves. Now I talk about enslaved. That's an entirely thoughtful and good change. But I don't think we should condemn people who are still using the old world, which sometimes happens. And I think we should be careful about condemning people for their language when it comes out for non-malevolent reasons.
Did you want to say something on Cody? Catherine?
I think I'll pass on this. I just wanted to listen.
Yeah. Well, thank you for a fascinating set of contributions and a good conversation. I'm going to give you and before we close, I think, and some final words to say.
But I think you'll all agree that this has been a very thought-provoking afternoon, where, I mean, if we're to sum up sort of things, which it's impossible to do, that we have to think about the ways in which history, both quite long ago and more recently, impact on the present and affect the ways in which we imagined the futures that we want, and therefore that we need the evidence base in order to think about how to move towards more hopeful futures. But also that we have to not only think about temporality, but also intersectionality, think about difference between different groups, places, etc., and that we have to be prepared to have difficult and depressing conversations, and to do that in a way that still maintains hope. Anyway, enough of that. I can't sum up today, and it'd be interesting to hear how you'll sum it up in conversations later. But I'd like to, first of all, thank all the speakers that we've had today. I think that they have been brilliant, that they have really helped us to think forward, and that they've opened up this public launch of RDUK in a way that is memorable, is worthwhile, thought-provoking, interesting, all those things. And clearly, they've put work into keeping their presentation short. So let's give them a big clap now. But before we close, I'm going to ask you to listen again just for another minute or so, because I'd like to invite Raj Patel, who is on the steering group of RDUK, to speak to us from the floor about a consultation about what Understanding Society is doing.
Thank you very much, Anne. And again, I hope, is the mic working? Yes. Okay. Yeah, I can see Nuffield has laid out some nice reception treats for us. So without much ado, and say to me, I've got about a minute to inform you about an opportunity coming your way. I guess in this audience, I probably don't need to convince you about the value of collecting high quality ongoing data, because without data, we remain invisible. And so that's really vital. Understanding Society, which is the UK Household Longitudinal Study, has been collecting information on the changing lives of people in the UK for 20 years now, and that includes the 5 largest racialized groups as well. And it seems to us that it's probably a good time to revisit those questions and ask, what do we need to be collecting over the next 10 to 15 years? And drop the questions that maybe have given us facts, insights that we don't need anymore, and ask about what are the emerging questions where we need new data, new questions. So if you're interested in that conversation about the future, we've got a couple of consultation events planned in January and February. Pick up a leaflet outside. It gives you a contact name. Tiago's here. Talk to him. He's organizing the workshops if you'd like to take part, and he'll let you know when they're happening. One's going to be online, one's going to be face-to-face. So we hope that's going to enable everyone to take part. And if you need to know anything else, people online, I think we'll post a link to the website as well. So by all means, hopefully click on that and register an interest in the workshops. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.